All right, settle in your cozy bed, you lovely, unsuspecting humans, and prepare yourselves. Prepare to have your cherished illusions thoroughly scrubbed away, much like a Roman after a particularly vigorous strigil session. Though, let's be honest, that wasn't nearly as clean as you probably think. You're here because you harbor a quaint, probably quite misguided notion about ancient Rome. You've seen the movies, haven't you? The epic sagas, the historical dramas, the ones with the sweeping marble vistas, and the impeccably draped togas that somehow remain pristine white despite centuries of gritty Roman life. You've imagined the patricians, reclining on velvet, perfumed with exotic oils, their skin glowing under the Mediterranean sun, their teeth, by some historical miracle, Hollywood white. Let me just pause for a moment to allow that shimmering, sepia-toned fantasy to fully unfurl in your mind's eye. See it? The gleaming mosaics, the clean-shaven senators, the elegant matrons with their impossibly fresh linen. Perhaps a waft of lavender and rosewater drifts through your mental image. A truly beautiful lie, isn't it? A testament to the power of cinematic magic and our collective desire to believe that at least somebody in history managed to keep it together. Well, I'm here to burst that perfumed bubble with the rather blunt, unsanitized point of a Roman strigil. Consider me your historical hygienist, here to scrape away the comforting layers of romanticized fiction and expose the rather more organic reality beneath. You're about to embark on a journey, not of enlightenment, but of unsettling historical truths, delivered with the appropriate level of dark amusement, because, frankly, if you don't laugh, you'll probably just gag. The grand illusion, then, it's practically ingrained in our cultural consciousness. You picture the Romans, and you picture cleanliness. Marble, baths, aqueducts, all symbols of a society that valued order, beauty, and, by extension, hygiene. We've been fed a steady diet of Hollywood's greatest hits, where Russell Crowe's Maximus is always impeccably stubbled, yet never smells of horse and fear, and Cleopatra's bathwater is invariably crystal clear. They show you the exterior, the awe-inspiring engineering, the architectural splendor, and your brain, bless its optimistic little heart, fills in the blanks with sparkling purity. Surely, you think, a people capable of building a structure like the Colosseum or an aqueduct that spans valleys must have had their personal cleanliness absolutely squared away. And to that, I offer a dry, historical chuckle. Oh, sweet summer child, you have no idea. The dirty reality check is this. Romans weren't clean by anything resembling our modern standards, not by a long shot. They were, to put it politely, differently clean, or, perhaps more accurately, differently dirty. Their approach to hygiene was a fascinating, often contradictory blend of sophisticated public works and, frankly, baffling personal practices. Imagine, if you will, a society that builds monumental sewers, but then uses a shared sponge-on-a-stick for toilet paper. A society that brings fresh water from miles away, only to channel it through lead pipes and then bathe in communal, lukewarm body broth. It's a paradox wrapped in an enigma, smeared with something unidentifiable. And we're going to peel back every single one of those gloriously grimy layers. Our mission, should you choose to accept this sensory assault, is to plunge head first into the very real, often quite disgusting, truth about daily life and hygiene in the Roman Empire. We're going to dismantle the myth of Roman purity piece by agonizing piece. We'll explore the sophisticated, yet ultimately flawed, systems they devised, and the rather less sophisticated, and often downright horrifying, individual habits that defined their existence. We're going to talk about the smells, the sights, the textures, and yes, the lingering sense of unease that comes from truly understanding what it meant to live in a world without germ theory, without antibacterial soap, and without the fundamental understanding that sharing is not always caring, especially when it comes to bodily fluids. So, buckle up, or perhaps brace your nostrils. This is going to be a wild, wonderfully foul ride through ancient grime, and by the end of it, you'll probably want to take about 3 showers with industrial strength disinfectant, maybe 4. The Roman baths. You picture them, don't you? Those architectural marvels, those temples to relaxation and civic pride, gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. Colossal structures of marble, soaring arches, intricate mosaics, all designed with an elegance that still makes modern architects weep with envy. From the grand, sprawling complexes, like the baths of Caracalla, a veritable coliseum of cleanliness, albeit one that hosted slightly less gladiatorial combat and significantly more communal scrubbing, to the more intimate neighborhood sudatoriums tucked away in side streets, these places were everywhere. They were the beating heart of Roman urban life, a testament to their engineering prowess and their appreciation for, well, something approximating hygiene. Truly magnificent structures, if you ignore for just a moment the faint, lingering scent of several thousand unwashed, sweating, probably slightly diseased bodies that permeated them for centuries. But let's be clear, these weren't just places to get clean. Oh no, that would be far too simple, far too modern. The Roman baths were the ultimate multi-hyphenate social club. Think of your local community center, gym, library, spa, public canteen, and perhaps a dimly lit corner of a brothel, all rolled into one sprawling, humid, often deafeningly loud complex. It was a place for business deals, political conspiracies, philosophical debates, and casual gossip. You could work out, get a massage, read a scroll, grab a snack, maybe even pick up a date, all within the same steam-filled, echo-laden walls. It was a microcosm of Roman society, a delightful cross-section of humanity, all sweating together in various stages of undress, rubbing elbows, sharing bodily fluids, and generally contributing to what one might affectionately call a human stew, seasoned with a liberal dash of infectious disease. Because nothing says civic unity quite like sharing a communal plunge pool with someone who might just have a delightful case of ringworm. So, let's walk through the daily ritual, shall we? You, a Roman citizen, or perhaps a slave, or a visitor, or anyone really, because these places were remarkably democratic in their filth, would first enter the apoditarium. This was the changing room, the locker room, if you will, though locker implies a level of security that likely didn't exist. You'd strip down, leaving your clothes and valuables in a cubby or with an attendant, hoping they'd still be there when you returned. Then, perhaps, to the palestra, an open-air exercise yard where you'd work up a good sweat. Wrestling, ball games, running, all designed to get the pores open, the blood pumping, and the body thoroughly, delightfully dank. Because, as we'll soon discover, the Roman cleansing process started with being as sweaty and grimy as humanly possible. After a good workout, thoroughly coated in your own perspiration and a healthy layer of palestra dust, you'd move into the heated rooms. First, perhaps the tepidarium, the warm room, designed to ease you into the heat. Then, the caldarium, the hot, steamy room where the real sweating would begin. And it was here, in the oppressive, humid heat, surrounded by dozens, perhaps hundreds of other Romans, that the communal grime truly began its glorious journey. The air would be thick with human vapor, with the smell of old sweat, with the earthy scent of unwashed bodies, all mingling with the expensive oils the wealthy might have slathered on beforehand. It wasn't merely a private experience. It was a deeply, profoundly shared one. You weren't just washing yourself. You were participating in a collective act of semi-cleanliness, where the line between your dirt and your neighbor's dirt became delightfully, hazardously blurred. Imagine the atmosphere, the shouts and laughter echoing off the marble, the splash of water, the scraping sound of strigils. Oh, we'll get to those, don't you worry. The general cacophony of a public space absolutely teeming with people. And through it all, the pervasive, almost tangible presence of sweat. Not just your own, mind you, but everyone else's. The oils, the general bodily emanations, the bits of dead skin flaking off, all of it suspended in the humid air, settling on the floors, mixing with the water. It wasn't a pristine spa experience. It was more like a human terrarium, a biological experiment in coexistence, where the main variable was how much bacteria you were willing to swap with your fellow citizens. And after all that delightful pre-soak in human juices, it was time for the main event, the scraping, which, as you can probably imagine, only made things more interesting. Now, if you've been picturing Romans frolicking in bubbly, perfumed water, lovingly scrubbing themselves with a nice bar of artisanal olive oil soap, I regret to inform you that your imagination has led you astray. Forget soap. Absolutely obliterate that concept from your mind. In ancient Rome, the go-to cleansing tool was the strigil. Imagine a curved piece of metal, usually bronze or iron, shaped like a question mark or a miniature scythe. This elegant little instrument was not for lathering, it was for scraping. Its function was brutally simple: to remove the layers of oil, sweat, dirt, and dead skin that had accumulated on your body. Think of it less as a loofah and more as a particularly aggressive, dull vegetable peeler for your epidermis. A truly delightful invention. The typical Roman, having worked up a substantial sweat in the palestra and simmered nicely in the caldarium, would then slather themselves with oil. This wasn't about moisturizing. It was about creating a medium. The oil would mix with all the lovely bodily secretions and grime, forming a thick, greasy paste. And then the scraping began. You'd take your strigil, or perhaps, if you were a person of means, a slave would perform this intimate act for you, and drag it across your skin. The curved edge would catch the oily gunk, peeling it away in satisfying, or horrifying, depending on your perspective, rolls of filth. Picture it, long ribbons of gray, greasy, bodily sludge being scraped from arms, legs, torsos. A truly visceral experience, and one that makes you wonder what, exactly, was considered a clean person back then. Now, this was a deeply personal act for many. You scraped your own filth. You faced your own grime head-on. But for the elite, this chore was often delegated. Imagine a servant, intimately familiar with your every curve and crevice, diligently scraping your skin clean. A truly intimate bonding experience, wouldn't you say? Or, perhaps, just another efficient way to spread whatever delightful pathogen you'd picked up from the floor of the caldarium or the communal hot tub. One wonders about the occupational hazards of being a professional body scraper. And then, after the scraping, after all that delightful gunk had been removed, what happened to it? Ah, the million sesterce question. The bucket of bodily fluids. Let's speculate, shall we? You've got all this scraped off gunk, this amalgamation of human dirt, oil, and probably more than a few bacteria. It's got to go somewhere. Was there a special, hygienically approved disposal method? Did they have designated filth receptacles that were regularly sanitized? Highly unlikely. More probable scenarios include scraping it directly into the drains in the bathhouse floor, where it would join the general river of bathwater and other effluvia, collecting it in a small bucket, which would then be unceremoniously dumped down a larger drain, or, in a truly inspired moment of Roman recycling, perhaps even selling it. Yes, you heard that right. There's some historical suggestion that the scraped-off gunk from famous athletes or gladiators might have been bottled and sold to women as a beauty product, believed to transfer the strength and virility of the source. Think about that for a moment. You could literally purchase a jar of someone else's ancient body grime. The mind and stomach reels. This method of cleansing, while perhaps effective at removing visible dirt, was hardly gentle. Imagine metal on skin, repeatedly, day after day, for those who frequented the baths regularly. This was abrasive skincare at its finest. It undoubtedly led to chafing, minor nicks, and perhaps even small cuts, especially if the scraper was used with a bit too much enthusiasm or if the skin was already delicate. And every single one of those tiny abrasions, a perfect open door for whatever delightful bacteria, fungi, or viruses were undoubtedly thriving in the warm, humid, communal environment of the baths. So while you might have emerged from the baths feeling lighter, perhaps even momentarily smoother, you were also quite possibly emerging with a fresh batch of microscopic hitchhikers ready to set up shop in your freshly scraped epidermis. The strigil. Truly a multi-purpose tool for cleaning, for exfoliating, and for inoculating. A real Roman 3-in-1. The Roman bathing experience wasn't just a singular dip. It was a carefully choreographed, temperature-controlled journey through various states of human discomfort and communal saturation. Each room served a purpose, a step in this elaborate dance of grime and steam, culminating in what Romans probably considered cleanliness, but what we, with our delicate modern sensibilities, might call a biological gauntlet. Let's start with the big one, the hot room, the caldarium. Imagine stepping into the caldarium. The air immediately hits you, thick and heavy, laden with steam and the unmistakable aroma of 1,000 collective armpits, damp wool, and perhaps a faint, lingering hint of whatever exotic and probably quite pungent oils the wealthy clientele had applied. This wasn't just warm, it was an oppressive, suffocating heat. Designed to induce a profuse sweat, it felt like being gently simmered in a human-sized pressure cooker. The humidity was so intense, you could practically chew the air. Walls would be streaming with condensation, creating a perpetually slick and vaguely fungal environment. Here, the goal was to sweat out toxins. A noble idea, though more likely you were just sweating out a significant portion of your bodily fluids, verging on dehydration. The sounds would be amplified, echoing off the wet marble. Shouts, laughter, the splish-splash of a communal fountain, the rhythmic scrape of a strigil, and the ever-present drone of human conversation, all swirling together in a humid, almost primordial soup. It was a place of extreme discomfort and profound social interaction, where personal space was a forgotten relic, and the definition of clean was simply less visibly dirty. After you'd thoroughly parboiled yourself in the caldarium, dripping with sweat and feeling vaguely lightheaded, you'd progress to the tepidarium. This was the warm room, a milder, slightly less infernal antechamber designed as a transition space. Think of it as the lukewarm palate cleanser between the searing heat and the inevitable cold shock. The tepidarium wasn't as steamy or stifling as the caldarium, but it was still warm enough to keep you sweating, albeit at a more genteel pace. This was often the true social hub of the baths. Here, people would linger longer, chatting, gossiping, conducting business, and generally enjoying the less intense, more breathable atmosphere. The sounds here would be less boisterous, more conversational. You'd hear hushed whispers, the rustle of towels, or what passed for them, and the gentle murmur of ancient banter. It was where the social lubricant flowed as freely as the sweat, making it a perfect spot for networking or just unwinding before the final bracing plunge. You might have seen people playing board games or simply sitting on the marble benches, engaging in philosophical debates about the optimal temperature for communal leisure. The air, while not as thick as the caldarium, still carried the accumulated scent of many bodies, now slightly cooled, mingling with whatever fragrances people had applied to mask the more pungent realities. And then, the moment of truth, the frigidarium, the cold plunge. After being thoroughly warmed, softened, and marinated in your own juices, and everyone else's, you would then make the shocking leap into a pool of icy cold water. This was meant to be invigorating, to close the pores, to firm the flesh, and generally to provide a jolt that would bring you back to full consciousness after the humid stupor of the hot rooms. For some, it was a refreshing shock. For others, perhaps a direct route to hypothermia, especially for the less robust or the perpetually chilled. The frigidarium was often quite grand, with a larger, deeper pool, the water looking deceptively clear until you plunged in and realized it was merely a slightly cooler version of the same communal liquid you'd been stewing in. The sounds would be gasps, shouts, the splash of bodies hitting the water, followed by rapid breathing. It was a quick, sharp, almost violent end to the bathing ritual, designed to send you out into the world feeling, well, alive, at least. This entire progression, this circuit of contamination, was a fascinating study in unintended consequences. You started in a hot, humid environment, perfect for opening pores and allowing bacteria to flourish on the skin. You then scraped off the grime, potentially creating microabrasions. Then you moved through various pools, each connected, each sharing the same water, each a potential vector for anything from mild skin irritations to more serious infections. The combination of warmth, moisture, and communal access created a perfect breeding ground for all sorts of delightful microscopic organisms. Skin conditions like ringworm or scabies could spread with alarming ease. Minor cuts or nicks could quickly become infected. It was a truly ingenious system, one that simultaneously aimed for cleanliness while inadvertently facilitating the rapid exchange of all manner of microbial delights. So, while you might have left the baths feeling refreshed and socially connected, you were also probably leaving with a new invisible friend or two, ready to make your acquaintance on a cellular level. Just another day in ancient Rome. One of the most remarkable and, frankly, most unsettling aspects of the Roman baths was their incredible accessibility. These weren't exclusive clubs for the wealthy elite. Oh no. The baths were, for a good portion of Roman history, open to almost everyone. Rich, poor, free, enslaved, men, women, children, all found their way into these steaming, splashing sanctuaries of communal hygiene. It was a true melting pot, a democratic mess, where the emperor might literally share a plunge pool with a plebeian, or at least be in the same complex as them. Proof that even in antiquity, misery, and more accurately, grime, truly loves company. This egalitarian approach to bodily exposure meant that the baths were a unique cross-section of Roman society, a place where social hierarchies, while not entirely absent, certainly blurred under the unifying sheen of sweat and steam. Imagine the sheer volume of humanity, each person contributing their own unique biological signature to the communal stew. It was less about individual cleanliness and more about collective participation in the grand Roman experiment of shared sanitation. Now, about gender separation, or rather the fascinating lack thereof and its rather fluid evolution. Our modern sensibilities might immediately assume strict segregation, but the reality was far more varied. In the early days, baths were often mixed, a delightful petri dish for society's entire gene pool. Can you imagine? Men and women, often in various states of undress, mingling freely, scraping away their grime side by side. Later, particularly during the imperial period, there were attempts at segregation. Sometimes different hours were allocated, men in the morning, women in the afternoon. Sometimes separate, smaller facilities were built for women, often attached to the main complex. But these rules weren't always strictly enforced, and historical accounts hint at periods where mixed bathing was still quite common, or at least tolerated, especially in smaller, less regulated establishments. This fluidity around gender segregation added another layer of social complexity, and certainly potential for scandal and disease transmission, to the already bustling bathhouse environment. It certainly made for excellent people-watching, if you could stand the humidity. Beyond mere bathing, the baths were also a notorious hub for all manner of transactions, both legitimate and, shall we say, less so. Business deals were struck in the tepidarium, political favors were whispered in the caldarium, and philosophical debates unfolded in the palestra. But the baths also had a distinct dark underbelly. Prostitution was rife. It was a place where people were already largely unclothed, where anonymity could be found in the steam, and where discretion was often a luxury few could afford or cared to maintain. Young men, women, and even children could be found offering various services, transforming parts of these grand public institutions into veritable brothels. Imagine conducting a serious business negotiation while just a few feet away, someone else is engaging in the oldest profession. The smells, the sounds, the sheer human drama, it was all part of the vibrant, sometimes sordid, tapestry of the Roman baths. And who else was in the water? Well, everyone. Children, for one. Roman kids were exposed to the communal bath environment from a young age, splashing around, probably picking up a delightful array of childhood ailments, and generally adding their youthful exuberance and bodily fluids to the mix. The elderly, too, would seek the therapeutic warmth and social connection of the baths, their weathered bodies easing into the lukewarm water, their stories adding to the cacophony. Even slaves, accompanying their masters, or employed directly by the baths, were part of this living, breathing, sweating ecosystem. Each individual, regardless of their station, their age, or their purpose, contributed to the overall biological richness of the bathwater. This meant that the range of bacteria, viruses, and fungi present was truly comprehensive, an impressive testament to the resilience of the human immune system, or perhaps the rapid decline of it. So, the next time you picture a pristine Roman bath, remember that it was a glorious, bustling, often filthy, incredibly diverse human soup, where every splash, every scrape, and every conversation contributed to the grand shared experience of ancient Roman life, and probably a rash. Now, let's talk about the Roman aqueducts. These, you have to admit, are genuinely awe-inspiring. Forget the grimy reality of the baths for a moment, and just appreciate the sheer scale, the precision, the audacious ambition of these engineering marvels. Miles upon miles of stone channels, some underground, some snaking across valleys on monumental arches, bringing a constant, cleanish supply of fresh water from distant springs and rivers directly into Rome. This wasn't just impressive, it was transformative. A testament to human ingenuity. A feat of civil engineering that provided the lifeblood for a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million people. Without the aqueducts, Rome as we know it simply wouldn't have existed. They were, in essence, the arteries of the empire, pumping liquid vitality into its very heart. A true marvel, sadly undermined by one tiny, seemingly innocuous, yet ultimately insidious detail: lead pipes. But we'll get to that. The source matters, of course. Where did all this miraculous water come from? Primarily, natural springs and rivers, sometimes lakes, often many miles outside the city. The Romans were meticulous in selecting their water sources, preferring springs known for their clear, cool, and apparently healthy water. They even conducted rudimentary taste and visual tests, and sometimes observed the health of local populations living near the source. This was a sophisticated understanding for its time, recognizing that some water was simply better than others. But while they could discern obvious signs of pollution or stagnation, they had no concept of microscopic contaminants. So, while the water might have looked sparkling and tasted fresh at the source, it could still contain any number of natural sediments, dissolved minerals, or even microscopic organic matter and bacteria from upstream animal life or human activity. It was clean in the sense that it wasn't obviously a cesspool, which for the time was a significant achievement. And then the lead. Oh, the beautiful, malleable, silent killer lead. The pervasive use of lead in Roman water infrastructure is one of those historical details that makes you wince, not just with hindsight, but with genuine medical dread. While the main aqueduct channels were stone or concrete, the distribution network, the pipes that carried water from the grand reservoirs to individual homes, public fountains, and, crucially, the baths, were often made of lead, thick, heavy, remarkably durable lead. Not just pipes, mind you, but also tanks, storage cisterns, and even some cooking utensils. The Romans simply didn't understand the dangers. They valued lead for its workability. It was easy to cast and shape, making it ideal for plumbing. Because nothing says public health quite like slowly, insidiously accruing brain damage, kidney damage, and a host of other delightful neurotoxic effects from the very water you drink and bathe in. Talk about a long-term investment in public degradation. Now, about filtration. How much natural filtration occurred? Well, quite a bit, arguably. The water often traveled through long, open channels, allowing some sediment to settle. There were sometimes settling tanks, called piscina limariae, built along the aqueduct's course, designed to slow the flow and allow heavier particles to drop out. These were sophisticated for their time, but they certainly weren't modern filtration plants. Fine particulate matter, organic detritus, and especially dissolved substances or microscopic organisms would sail right through. So, while the aqueducts delivered a far superior water supply than simply drawing from a local, often polluted river or well, it was by no means pure. It was a compromise. A brilliant feat of engineering that provided vast quantities of water, but whose quality, from our germ-aware perspective, was still profoundly questionable. The Romans had the quantity, they had the distribution, but the insidious lead, combined with their lack of understanding of microbiology, meant that even their greatest public health achievement carried within it the seeds of quiet, chronic illness. So, the aqueducts, those glorious conduits of hydration, brought a torrent of water into Rome. But once it arrived, its journey was far from over. It wasn't simply dumped into a giant communal reservoir. Instead, it embarked on a sophisticated, gravity-fed odyssey through the city, a testament to Roman urban planning that was simultaneously brilliant and, in its ultimate functionality, deeply unsanitary by modern reckoning. The first stop for much of this precious liquid was often the castellum aquae, a distribution tank, typically elevated, from which the water would then cascade into a vast network of public fountains. These fountains were the lifeblood of the city for the vast majority of its inhabitants, acting as the communal tap, the primary source of drinking water for hundreds of thousands of Romans who didn't have private plumbing. Imagine a Roman street scene, bustling, noisy, and, as we'll soon discover, profoundly smelly. Amidst this chaos, you'd find these public fountains, often beautifully adorned with carvings and statues, constantly gushing water. They were social hubs, meeting points, and places where the poor and the rich alike would come to fill their buckets, pitchers, and amphorae. The water flowed continuously, 24/7, a constant, refreshing stream. Why continuous flow? Partially to prevent stagnation, but also because Romans had not yet mastered sophisticated tap and valve technology that could easily control individual flow without causing immense pressure issues in the system. So it ran endlessly into basins and then into drains. This constant flow was seen as a sign of wealth, abundance, and civic generosity. It meant a fresh supply, at least in theory, was always available. But, of course, fresh is a relative term when you're fetching water from a spout that dozens of other people have touched, with buckets that might have been used for any number of less than sanitary purposes. Now, here's where things get really interesting and slightly stomach-churning. The Roman water system operated on a cascading principle, a beautiful, gravity-fed system of continuous reuse. The freshest, cleanest water went to the highest priority locations. First, to public fountains for drinking. But after that, the overflow, the water that wasn't consumed or collected, didn't just disappear. Oh no. It would then flow, still via gravity, to the next tier of consumption, the grand public baths. Imagine water that had just been gushing from a drinking fountain, potentially splashed by 100 hands, now flowing into the caldarium and frigidarium. And after circulating through the baths, soaking up all that delightful communal grime and bodily residue, it didn't stop there. From the baths, the water, now thoroughly enriched with human essence, would then be directed to flush the public latrines. Yes, the same water, now carrying the distinct biological signature of the entire city's bathers, was then used to wash away human waste. And from the latrines, this ever more contaminated liquid would finally find its way into the sewers, eventually making its way to the Tiber. It was an ingenious system for maximizing water usage, a truly remarkable feat of resource management for its time. But from a modern public health perspective, it was a tiered system of contamination, a continuous cycle of escalating biological risk. You were effectively drinking, bathing in, and flushing your waste with water that had been progressively dirtier at each stage of its journey. For the exceptionally wealthy, there was a slight reprieve, a luxury that came at a literal price. They could afford private pipe connections, often made, as we've discussed, of lead. This brought the still, potentially, lead-laden and imperfectly filtered bounty directly into their lavish villas. Private fountains, private baths, though these still often drained into the communal system, and even private latrines were a mark of status. So, while the poor queued at the public fountains and everyone else braved the communal baths, the rich could enjoy their own personal, slow-acting lead poisoning in the comfort of their own homes. The sheer volume of water used daily in Rome was staggering. Estimates suggest hundreds of millions of liters flowed into the city every day. And where did it all end up? In the most sophisticated, yet often overwhelmed, sewer system the ancient world had ever seen. A magnificent engineering feat that, despite its grandeur, still left Rome a remarkably, uniquely smelly place. All right, prepare yourselves. This is where the narrative really takes a turn for the truly visceral, where the concept of privacy as we understand it simply ceased to exist, and where basic human dignity might have gone to quietly die. We're talking about the public latrines of ancient Rome. Forget your pristine, porcelain-throned, individual cubicle modern bathroom. Instead, picture a long, often quite grand, hall. Rows and rows of marble seats, each with a keyhole-shaped opening cut into the stone. And here's the kicker. Absolutely no partitions. None. Zero. You sat shoulder to shoulder with your fellow citizens, conducting your most private bodily functions in what amounted to a very public, very social, and almost certainly very smelly open-plan office of excretion, where the concept of personal space went to die along with your dignity. The communal sponge on a stick. Yes, you heard that right. This is perhaps the most infamous and universally shudder-inducing innovation in Roman hygiene. The tersorium. After you had conducted your business, there wasn't a roll of soft paper at your elbow. Oh no. Instead, often along a trough of flowing water at your feet, you would find a sponge attached to a stick. And this sponge? It was shared among everyone using the latrine. Imagine one communal sponge used by dozens, perhaps hundreds of different people throughout the day for the most intimate of cleanups. The questions immediately leap to mind. Who cleaned the sponge? When? How often? Was there a designated sponge cleaner? Or did it just sort of rinse itself in the flowing water? Don't ask. Seriously, for the sake of your sanity and stomach, don't dwell on it too long. The very thought is enough to trigger a phantom itch. It's an innovation in hygiene that still makes us shudder, a truly horrifying testament to ancient resourcefulness and a fundamental ignorance of germ theory. Beneath those rows of marble seats, a constant stream of water would flow. This was often the overflow from the baths, or a direct branch from an aqueduct designed to carry away the waste. In theory, it worked. The continuous current would sweep the excrement into the main sewer system. In reality, however, the effectiveness was probably debatable and the smell undeniable. While the running water helped to mitigate the accumulation of waste directly beneath the seats, it could hardly eliminate the pervasive stench that would have filled these echoing halls. Imagine the mingling aromas: fresh waste, stale waste, the dampness of the stone, and the general humidity, all creating a unique olfactory signature that would forever be associated with Roman social gatherings. It was less a pleasant public facility and more a giant, perpetually flushing, open-air toilet bowl for an entire city. And yet, despite the profound lack of privacy and the alarming hygiene practices, these public latrines were, astonishingly, also social spaces. Yes, you heard that correctly. Romans socialized while shitting. It was where you might catch up with a friend, exchange the latest gossip, discuss philosophy, or even conduct business. Imagine pitching a new business venture to a senator while both of you are simultaneously engaged in a full-body evacuation. The sounds of digestion, the murmurs of conversation, the splash of the flowing water, all combining into a rather bizarre symphony of Roman life. People would sit and chat, sometimes for extended periods, perhaps even playing board games. It truly showcases a fundamentally different attitude towards bodily functions and public decorum. For a modern person, the idea of doing anything but fleeing such a place immediately after completion of one's business is unthinkable. For the Romans, it was just another Tuesday, another opportunity for networking, or simply another way to pass the time while performing a universal and universally unglamorous act. Truly, the communal throne of horrors. If the public latrines were where dignity went to die, the Roman sewer system was where everything else went to disappear. And disappear it did, into an awe-inspiring network of subterranean engineering that still stands today as a testament to Roman ingenuity. The Cloaca Maxima, the greatest sewer, is the star of this show. A colossal, vaulted masterpiece that has been draining Rome for over 2 millennia. It's not just a ditch, it's an underground river, robustly constructed with massive stone blocks, capable of handling immense volumes of water, and, well, everything else. This and other Roman sewers played an absolutely vital role in keeping the city from drowning in its own effluent. They were designed to drain the city, to carry away not just human waste, but also bathwater, street runoff, and all the miscellaneous detritus of urban life. A grand, unseen infrastructure, ensuring that Rome, at least on the surface, remained somewhat habitable. But what precisely went down there? The short answer: everything. The long answer, and the truly unsettling one, a glorious, disgusting cocktail of everything unspeakable. Yes, human waste from the latrines, certainly, but also the vast quantities of water from the public baths, carrying with it all the accumulated grime, oils, and biological residue of the city's bathers. Then add to that the general street runoff, rain washing away the accumulated garbage, animal dung, and whatever else had been casually tossed into the streets. And speaking of animals, quite often, animal carcasses from the markets, or simply those unfortunate enough to expire in the streets, would find their way into the system. industrial effluent from tanneries, dye works, and other pungent crafts, often laden with unpleasant chemicals and organic waste, was also piped directly into the sewers. It was a truly comprehensive waste disposal system, accepting all comers, creating a perpetually flowing river of urban horror beneath the very feet of the citizens. How did this impressive, yet profoundly disgusting underground network interact with the city above? The answer is quite intimately and quite odoriferously. The sewer system wasn't hermetically sealed. There were numerous openings, grates on the streets, vents, and direct connections from buildings and latrines. And these openings meant one thing above all else: smell. A pervasive, inescapable stench would have risen from the sewers, particularly on hot days or when the system was under stress. Imagine the concentrated aroma of all those accumulated wastes, fermenting and mingling, wafting up through every grate, every crack, every access point. This wasn't just an occasional whiff. This was the background scent of ancient Rome. And with the stench came the vermin. Rats, mice, and various insects would have thrived in the dark, warm, waste-filled tunnels, emerging through the openings to scurry across streets and invade homes, bringing with them a delightful array of diseases. The health implications of these open sewer grates, allowing pathogens and disease vectors direct access to the urban environment, are chillingly obvious in retrospect. And maintenance? Who maintained these colossal structures? The cloaca maxima was an engineering triumph. But even triumphs require upkeep. Slaves or lower-class laborers would have been tasked with the truly unenviable job of navigating the dark, foul-smelling tunnels, clearing blockages, repairing damage, and generally ensuring the system remained functional. It was a brutal, thankless task, one fraught with danger from methane gas buildup, leading to explosions, a very real threat in ancient sewer systems, disease, and drowning in the event of a sudden surge. And despite their efforts, blockages were inevitable. Imagine a sudden, torrential downpour, overwhelming the system, causing raw sewage to back up and overflow into the streets, mingling with the fresh rainwater, creating a truly apocalyptic urban river of filth. It was a constant battle, a never-ending war against the sheer volume of human and urban detritus. So, while the Roman sewer system was undoubtedly a marvel, it was also a magnificent, perpetually overflowing monument to the empire's magnificent, perpetually flowing waste. The private toilet. A privilege reserved for the wealthy, a mark of status that separated the patrician from the plebeian, the villa owner from the tenement dweller who relied on public latrines or, more likely, a chamber pot and a prayer. For the elite, the convenience of a private latrine, a latrina within their own domus or villa, was a significant step up from the communal experience. No shared sponges, no jostling elbows, no philosophical debates over a communal cesspit. But don't, for a single moment, imagine anything resembling your sleek, hygienic, individually flushing modern commode. Oh no. A Roman private toilet, while offering privacy, was often still quite questionable in its overall cleanliness and, frankly, its design. One of the most striking and, to us, utterly baffling aspects of private Roman latrines was their location. Forget the idea of a secluded bathroom tucked away in a quiet corner of the house. Often, these private conveniences were situated in close proximity to the kitchen or even directly adjacent to communal areas. Why? Because connecting them to the running water supply, if available, or the sewer system was paramount, and these services were often routed near the kitchen for other domestic purposes. So imagine a Roman dinner party. The aromas of roasted pheasant, spiced wine, and freshly baked bread waft through the triclinium. And just through that thin wall, or perhaps just across the courtyard, the subtle, unmistakable aroma of your own family's waste, slowly percolating up from the drain. Because nothing aids digestion quite like the nuanced bouquet of your personal sewage. It truly speaks to a different sensory tolerance, or perhaps a simply overwhelmed olfactory system. And flushing mechanisms? Limited, to say the least. The concept of a modern, efficient flushing toilet with a cistern and a powerful siphonic action was millennia away. For those connected directly to a sewer, the waste might simply drop straight down, relying on the sewer's flow to carry it away. This, of course, meant a direct, unfiltered connection to the smells and vermin of the sewer system, allowing those delightful aromas and creatures to waft right back up into your private sanctum. For those without a direct sewer connection, flushing often involved buckets of water. A slave would stand by, pouring water down the chute after each use, a laborious and still not entirely effective method. Or it could just be a simple pit latrine, periodically emptied. So while you might have had the luxury of solitude, the underlying mechanics were still primitive, labor-intensive, and fundamentally aromatic. The perils of the private toilet were numerous and varied, turning a simple trip to the loo into a potential adventure. The most common risk for any toilet connected to the sewer system was the ever-present threat of rats and, more alarmingly, snakes. Imagine sitting there, minding your own business, when a rather large, angry rat or a slithering serpent decides to make a surprise upward journey. A truly terrifying prospect. A truly terrifying prospect. And then there were the less slithery, but equally alarming dangers. Methane gas buildup. Untreated sewage produces methane. In enclosed spaces, this gas can accumulate, and if a spark or flame is introduced, perhaps from a lamp or a brazier used for heating, the results could be explosive, literally. There are historical accounts and archaeological findings suggesting that such toilet explosions were a very real, very unsettling hazard of Roman private latrines. So, a true adventure every time you had to go. The private toilet, then, was a symbol of Roman luxury, convenience, and a rather unique form of daily Russian roulette. Let's talk about hair, specifically the Roman obsession with not having it. At least, not in certain places. And certainly not if you were a woman of status or a man striving for a particular aesthetic. In ancient Rome, hair was often seen as a sign of barbarism, a mark of the uncivilized, wild peoples beyond the empire's borders. Or, if you were a philosopher who had truly given up on all worldly pleasures, perhaps you could get away with a scruffy beard. But for the fashionable, the socially ambitious, and particularly for women, smooth, hairless skin was the ideal. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a strong cultural preference, a mark of sophistication and civilization. The pursuit of hairlessness was, therefore, a serious, often painful, and frequently quite dangerous endeavor. The methods of removal were, shall we say, varied and universally unpleasant. First, the tweezers, or volsellae. These were small metal pincers, often made of bronze, used for plucking individual hairs. Imagine the sheer tedium and the pain. Plucking a single eyebrow hair is annoying. Imagine plucking an entire armpit or an entire pubic area. This was a painstaking, time-consuming, and utterly agonizing process, likely reserved for smaller, more delicate areas, or for those with an exceptionally high pain threshold and an abundance of free time. Not exactly a quick wax and dough. Then we have razors, the novacula. These were typically made of bronze or iron, and by modern standards, they were almost certainly blunt, prone to nicks, and guaranteed to leave you with a rather raw, irritated skin. Imagine trying to get a close, clean shave with a piece of poorly sharpened metal, without the benefit of shaving cream, hot water, or any real understanding of post-shave care. For men, regular shaving was common, especially for the smooth-faced ideal prevalent during the early empire. But this was a shaving experience only a masochist could truly love, probably resulting in frequent cuts, razor burn, and ingrown hairs. And for women, shaving was also practiced, particularly for body hair, adding another layer of discomfort and potential infection. Depilatory creams and waxes also existed, but again, these were not the gentle, soothing formulas you might find in a modern spa. Roman concoctions were crude, often quite caustic, and sometimes downright dangerous. Resins, pitch, animal fats, and plant extracts were mixed together, heated, and applied, and then yanked off, taking hair and often a layer of skin with it. Some recipes even included ingredients like arsenic, quicklime, or other harsh chemicals, promising hair removal while delivering a delightful chemical burn, skin irritation, or even systemic poisoning with every application. A true Roman 2-for-1, hair removal, plus a side of potentially chronic dermatitis. What a bargain! And then, for the truly desperate, or perhaps just the deeply misguided, there was burning. Yes, singeing off hair with oil lamps or hot nuts was a known practice. Imagine the smell of burning hair, the searing heat against your skin, the distinct possibility of accidentally charring yourself in the process, guaranteed to leave you smelling like a badly cooked sacrificial offering, and probably with patchy, irritated skin. This was definitely not for the faint of heart, or for those who valued their undamaged epidermis. The barber shop, the tonstrina, was a social hub for men, where they could get a shave, a haircut, and catch up on the latest gossip. but it was also a veritable den of questionable hygiene. Imagine multiple clients, one after another, being shaved with the same bronze or iron razor, perhaps just wiped clean between uses, or simply dipped in lukewarm water. The risk of spreading skin infections, fungal conditions, and even blood-borne pathogens from nicks and cuts would have been incredibly high. So while you might have left the tonstrina feeling freshly shaven and well-informed, you were also probably leaving with a new microscopic souvenir, silently hitching a ride on your freshly exposed skin. The ancient art of depilation, a testament to aesthetic determination, and a constant reminder that beauty standards often come with a rather hefty price in pain and potential disease. The Roman obsession with appearances wasn't confined to hair removal. It extended quite dramatically to the face itself. Roman cosmetics were a fascinating blend of natural ingredients, exotic imports, and, frankly, outright poisonous compounds. The goal? To achieve a particular aesthetic, one that often meant looking ethereal, wealthy, and, if you weren't careful, slowly but surely poisoning yourself. A classic Roman 2-for-1, beauty plus a side of neurotoxicity. The pursuit of pale skin was paramount, particularly for women. A fair complexion was a clear sign of wealth and leisure, distinguishing you from the sun-kissed laborers and slaves. To achieve this alabaster look, Roman women frequently turned to cerussa, a lead-based white makeup. Yes, lead. The same toxic heavy metal we now assiduously avoid. Lead carbonate, ground into a fine powder and mixed with oil or fat, created a thick, opaque white paste that was applied liberally to the face, neck, and sometimes even the hands. It provided excellent coverage, creating a strikingly pale, smooth complexion. For a while. The long-term effects, of course, were devastating. Chronic lead poisoning, leading to skin lesions, hair loss, digestive problems, kidney failure, and neurological damage. So while you might have looked radiantly pale in your youth, by middle age you could expect to be ravaged by the very beauty product designed to enhance your appearance. A truly dark irony. Beyond the ghostly pallor, Roman women also adorned their faces with color. Rouge was popular, typically made from red ochre, madder root, or even crushed mulberries, applied to the cheeks and lips. For the eyes, kohl, often made from antimony or soot, was used to darken and define the lashes and brows, giving a dramatic, almond-eyed effect. Green eyeshadows, derived from malachite, were also known. These pigments, while less overtly toxic than lead, were still often applied without much concern for hygiene. Fingers were the primary applicators, meaning dirt, bacteria, and whatever else was on one's hands, or the hands of one's slave, were introduced directly to the delicate skin around the eyes and mouth. The result? Frequent eye infections, skin irritation, and general dermatitis were likely common companions to Roman beauty. And what about masking the less pleasant realities of Roman life, like persistent body odor? Perfumes and oils were used extensively, not just for pleasure, but out of sheer necessity. These were sophisticated concoctions, often made from exotic resins, floral essences like rose, jasmine, and lily, and animal musks, civet, musk deer. These luxurious fragrances were applied to the body, hair, and even clothing. They were, however, a strategy of masking, not of removing. While they provided a temporary olfactory reprieve, they couldn't undo the fundamental lack of comprehensive cleansing. It was like trying to hide a garbage dump with a single air freshener, a noble, yet ultimately futile effort. You smelled, then you smelled more expensively. The dark side of Roman beauty, then, was multifaceted. The toxic ingredients, as we've noted, were a major concern, leading to chronic health issues and premature aging. But beyond the poisons, there was the sheer lack of sterile application. Without knowledge of germ theory, cosmetics were often prepared and applied in less than hygienic conditions. Brushes and applicators, if used at all, were likely shared and rarely cleaned. Jars and pots of creams and powders were left open, collecting dust and bacteria. This inevitably led to a host of skin problems, acne, rashes, infections, and allergic reactions would have been a constant battle. The Roman ideal of beauty, while superficially alluring, was often achieved at a significant cost to health, resulting in a population that, for all their efforts, probably sported a rather unique array of cosmetic-induced skin ailments. A beautiful tragedy, indeed. Let's turn our attention now to the Roman smile, or perhaps the Roman grimace. Because despite their advanced society in so many other regards, Roman dental hygiene was primitive, to say the least. Forget pearly whites. A more realistic aim was probably mostly still attached. The concept of regular, effective brushing and flossing was centuries away, replaced by practices that range from the mildly ineffective to the downright horrifying. You thought the strigil was bad? Just wait until we get to the mouthwash. Toothpastes and powders did exist, but they were far removed from the minty fresh gels we know today. Roman recipes called for a fascinating array of abrasive ingredients: crushed bone from various animals, eggshells, oyster shells, pumice stone, and various plant ashes. These were ground into powders, sometimes mixed with honey or other binding agents, and then rubbed onto the teeth with fingers or a rough cloth. While these concoctions were certainly abrasive enough to remove some surface stains and food particles, they were also likely quite damaging to tooth enamel and gums. Imagine scrubbing your teeth with powdered bone or pumice. It might have made them feel cleaner for a moment, but the long-term impact on dental health would have been detrimental, leading to wear, sensitivity, and gum irritation. And as for fighting decay or bad breath, highly ineffective. Now, for the piece de résistance, the crown jewel of Roman oral hygiene, the practice that truly separates the historical layman from the deeply informed, slightly nauseated expert: urine mouthwash. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Romans, in their boundless ingenuity and profound ignorance of microbiology, discovered that urine, particularly stale, fermented urine, was an effective mouthwash. Why? Because stale urine contains ammonia, a natural bleaching agent and disinfectant. And if you're thinking, wait, what kind of urine? The answer is even more specific. Portuguese urine was especially prized for its potency. Imagine the international trade routes now carrying barrels of fermented human effluvia, destined for the mouths of Roman elites. Nothing says fresh breath quite like a swig of fermented bodily fluid, does it? The idea was that the ammonia would whiten teeth and kill bacteria, though it undoubtedly left an entirely different, arguably worse, taste and odor. It's one of those historical facts that makes you deeply, profoundly grateful for modern Listerine, despite its sometimes aggressive burn. Roman dentistry, too, was a rather brutal affair. Primitive extractors, files, and drills were used to treat various dental woes. Without anesthetics, without antiseptic practices, and with only a rudimentary understanding of oral anatomy, dental procedures would have been agonizingly painful and fraught with the risk of severe infection. Tooth decay, gum disease, and abscesses were rampant. When a tooth hurt, the primary solution was often extraction, performed with crude instruments and often leading to further complications. Imagine the raw agony, the lingering pain, the open wounds in the mouth, ripe for bacterial invasion. It makes you appreciate your twice-yearly dental checkup, doesn't it? Finally, the impact of the Roman diet. While not as sugar-laden as modern diets, it still contributed significantly to oral health issues. Gritty, unrefined bread, often containing small fragments of millstones, would have caused significant wear and tear on teeth. Fruit, honey, and other sugary treats, consumed without effective cleaning, would have contributed to tooth decay. So, between abrasive tooth powders, a diet that damaged enamel, primitive tools, and the truly unique choice of mouthwash, the Roman smile was likely a rather short-lived and painful affair. The average Roman probably faced a lifetime of dental discomfort, making you wonder just how much conversation they could comfortably engage in after a particularly vigorous session of urine gargling. Hair in ancient Rome was more than just something that grew on your head. It was a political statement, a social marker, a fashion accessory, and occasionally a profound source of anxiety. Hairstyles, particularly for women, could be incredibly elaborate, signaling status, marital status, or adherence to the latest trends. For men, hair could convey age, philosophical inclination, or military rank. The politics of hair were serious business. Dyeing and bleaching were common practices, a testament to the Roman desire to alter their natural appearance. Women, especially, would bleach their hair to achieve a fashionable blonde or reddish hue, often using harsh chemicals like lye, or plant extracts such as saffron or henna. For darker hair, concoctions of lead, walnut husks, or other natural pigments were employed. The results, while perhaps achieving the desired color, were often accompanied by side effects. Imagine a vibrant new color, but with a slightly inflamed scalp, brittle hair, or even a delightful allergic reaction to the various caustic substances. The Roman pursuit of the perfect shade was often a chemically hazardous one, a gamble with scalp integrity and hair health. Wigs and hair extensions were absolutely essential for achieving the towering, intricate coiffures favored by Roman women, especially during the imperial period. These weren't subtle additions. They were often elaborate, architectural creations designed to impress and signify wealth. Hair was imported, often from conquered peoples, blonde hair from Germanic tribes, dark hair from slaves in the East. This recycled human hair was painstakingly woven and styled, sometimes on frames, to create truly monumental hairdos that could incorporate braids, curls, and intricate loops. Imagine the weight, the discomfort, and the sheer effort involved in maintaining such a structure. And then, of course, the hygiene implications. Human hair, not always sourced in the most sterile conditions, and then worn for extended periods, providing a perfect habitat for lice and other delightful microscopic residents. Recycling human hair, one fashionable and potentially infested statement at a time. And then there was baldness. For Roman men, losing one's hair was often a source of great distress, particularly for those in public life, where a full head of hair was associated with virility and strength. Emperors themselves, like Julius Caesar, were famously sensitive about their receding hairlines, often using laurel wreaths or elaborate comb-overs to conceal their baldness. This anxiety led to a vast array of purported and almost certainly ineffective remedies for hair loss. These concoctions often involved exotic ingredients: bear grease, horse urine, goat dung, snake oil, or various mashed-up herbs. Imagine rubbing a paste of animal fats and questionable excretions into your scalp, hoping for follicular miracles. The smell alone must have been enough to deter even the most desperate. While some may have found comfort in the ritual, actual hair regrowth was almost certainly a placebo effect, if anything at all. The Roman battle against baldness was a testament to human vanity, fought with an arsenal of unproven, often repulsive, and ultimately futile remedies. The hair game, it seems, was just as complicated and fraught with biological hazards in ancient Rome as it is today, albeit with significantly more lead and animal byproducts. Let's turn our attention now to what the Romans wore, and more importantly, how often they cleaned it. The grand, flowing toga, that iconic symbol of Roman citizenship, might look pristine in statues, but in reality, it was a truly impractical, heavy, and magnificent magnet for dirt. Picture yards and yards of unhemmed wool or linen, draped and folded with precise, elaborate pleats. Now imagine trying to keep that pristine in a dusty, crowded, manure-laden city like Rome. It was a Herculean task. A garment designed for dramatic effect, but profoundly ill-suited for daily life in a fundamentally grimy environment. Material matters, of course. Wool and linen were the dominant fabrics, with silk being an exotic, expensive rarity. Wool, while warm, absorbs odors readily and is notoriously difficult to clean. Linen is lighter and breathes better, but also wrinkles easily and shows dirt. So, how often were these elaborate, heavy, and often expensive garments actually washed? Not often, by our standards. Daily bathing was common for many, but daily laundry was absolutely not. For the poor, a tunic might be worn for weeks or even months without a thorough cleaning. For the wealthy, while their clothing might be changed more frequently, the actual washing process was a specialized, industrial affair, not a home chore. The sheer scale and complexity of washing a toga meant it wasn't something you simply tossed in a basin. It was an event. This brings us to the fuller's art, the fullonica. These were the professional laundromats of ancient Rome, but calling them laundromats is like calling a chariot a car. This was serious business, a specialized industry employing a significant workforce. Fullers were not just washermen. They were vital to the Roman economy and daily life. They performed a crucial, if somewhat stomach-churning service. You wouldn't simply drop off your dirty laundry. You'd entrust it to these artisans of stench and stain removal. And how did they achieve such impressive, or again, stomach-churning feats of cleaning? With the help of one very special, very Roman ingredient: urine. Ammonia-rich urine, collected from public urinals placed throughout the city, and sometimes even from private homes, with an eager fuller making the rounds, was a primary cleaning agent. Why urine? Because the ammonia acts as a natural detergent, cutting through grease and dissolving dirt. So yes, the process involved soaking your clothes in pee for cleanliness. A truly Roman paradox, a testament to their resourcefulness and their supreme indifference to what we might call conventional hygiene. The process itself was arduous. Fullers would typically stomp on the clothes in large vats of water and urine. Imagine a group of men, bare-legged, trampling yards of wool or linen in a pungent, yellowish liquid, agitating the fabric, working out the dirt with their feet. It was a physical, dirty, and profoundly smelly job. After this initial wash, the clothes would be rinsed, then often bleached. How did they bleach? With sulfur fumes. The garments would be draped over wicker frames and placed over burning sulfur, the fumes of which would whiten the fabric. This was effective, but it also left a distinct, slightly acrid smell in the clothes. Finally, the garments would be brushed, pressed, and sometimes even fulled, a process of shrinking and thickening wool fabric to make it more dense and water-resistant. Despite these elaborate, multi-step efforts, Roman clothing likely retained a distinct odor. The urine-based wash, the sulfur bleaching, the lingering body odors from repeated wear, and the general grime of a Roman city meant that even clean clothes probably carried a subtle, earthy, and perhaps slightly ammoniacal aroma. It was a different world of scent, one where what we consider clean was simply a reduction of the most overwhelming stenches. So, while your toga might have appeared white for a short time, a close sniff would probably reveal the complex olfactory history of its journey through the fuller's workshop. A reminder that sometimes the effort of cleanliness itself leaves its own indelible mark. Having discussed the magnificent sewer system that channeled some of Rome's waste, it's crucial to acknowledge that much of the city's detritus never even made it to the Cloaca Maxima. Instead, it lingered, accumulated, and generally contributed to the overarching atmosphere of grime and stench that defined Roman urban life. We're talking about street litter and debris, the casual daily dumping of household garbage directly onto the streets. Think about your own trash day. Except imagine there is no trash day, and everyone just chucks their refuse out the window or onto the nearest alleyway. What kind of delightful refuse are we talking about? Everything you can imagine from a household without modern waste disposal. Food scraps, certainly. Gnawed bones, vegetable peelings, fruit rinds, stale bread. Then there's the packaging. Broken pottery, discarded amphorae, bits of cloth, wood shavings, and, of course, the general detritus of daily life. Broken tools, old sandals, construction rubble, and the ubiquitous dust and dirt. This wasn't an occasional piece of litter. It was a constant buildup, a perpetual accumulation of refuse that transformed alleyways, less trafficked side streets, and forgotten corners into impromptu landfills. The sheer volume of waste generated by a city of 1 million people, coupled with limited or non-existent formal collection, meant that Rome was, at its heart, a massive, ongoing archaeological dig in waiting. While some official regulations regarding street cleaning and waste disposal did exist, their enforcement was, to put it mildly, likely lax. Imagine the logistical nightmare of trying to keep a city of Rome's size clean with rudimentary tools and a massive, often indifferent population. The sheer scale made it a monumental, perhaps impossible task. So, while an aedile might issue an edict about keeping thoroughfares clear, the reality on the ground was often a chaotic, ever-growing mountain of muck. Pedestrians would navigate these impromptu landfills, stepping over refuse, trying to avoid the most egregious piles of decaying matter, all while the various odors mingled into a unique and profoundly unpleasant urban bouquet. And then, of course, there were nature's rather unglamorous cleanup crew. With such an abundance of organic waste readily available, Rome wasn't just a human city. It was a bustling metropolis for every creature great and small, especially the small and disgusting. Dogs, stray cats, and, most importantly, rats and mice would feast on the urban waste, thriving in the refuse-strewn streets and alleyways. These scavengers, while performing a valuable service in consuming some of the garbage, also contributed to the problem by spreading disease, leaving their own droppings, and generally acting as vectors for all manner of unpleasant pathogens. Flies, attracted to decaying organic matter, would swarm in buzzing clouds, landing on food stalls, people, and everything in between, carrying bacteria from the filth directly to the dinner table. It was a symbiotic relationship, perhaps, but one built on a foundation of pervasive unsanitation. So, while the grand Roman monuments soared towards the sky, below them, on the very streets, lay a teeming, rotting testament to the empire's profoundly imperfect waste management. And the smell? Oh, the smell. If the streets of Rome were a visual and olfactory assault, then its culinary landscape was a dicey daily game of bacterial roulette. Imagine the journey of food, from the sun-drenched farms of Campania to the bustling markets of Rome, all without the aid of refrigeration, modern packaging, or even a rudimentary understanding of germ theory. Every meal was, in essence, a thrilling gamble, a roll of the dice where the stakes were often dysentery, typhoid, or a truly spectacular stomach upset. The journey from farm to forum was fraught with peril. Produce, grain, meat, and fish would be transported over varying distances, often for days, exposed to the elements. Dust from unpaved roads, flies, animal waste, and the general grime of the countryside would cling to everything. There were no temperature-controlled containers, no sealed packaging. Freshness was a rapidly deteriorating commodity, especially for perishable goods like meat and fish. Contamination risks during transport were immense, with foodstuffs mingling with whatever was on the cart, the road, or the hands of the transporters. It was a race against spoilage, a battle often lost before the food even reached the city gates. Once at the market, the mayhem truly began. Imagine an open-air market teeming with people, animals, and, inevitably, flies. Hundreds of unregulated food stalls, each hawking its wares, often directly exposed to the elements. Dust from the unpaved ground would be kicked up by passing feet, settling on the bread, the fruit, the drying fish. Flies, freshly arrived from the nearest pile of horse manure or rotting garbage, would buzz contentedly over everything, landing on the meat, then on your hand, then back on the meat. Sanitation standards were virtually non-existent. Vendors handled food with bare hands, money changed hands, then food changed hands again. The concept of cross-contamination was entirely unknown. It was an environment perfectly designed for the rapid spread of foodborne illnesses, where every meal was a culinary adventure you might regret. Meat and fish, the most perishable of goods, were particularly problematic. Without refrigeration, they were sold and consumed quickly, often within a day of slaughter or catch. But even that short window was enough for spoilage to begin, especially in the Mediterranean heat. Meat would often be dried, salted, or smoked to preserve it, but even these methods weren't foolproof. Fish, brought in from the coast, would begin to rot quickly, and vendors might use various tricks to disguise the signs of spoilage, like rinsing it in questionable water or dousing it in strong sauces. The sale of fresh meat and fish was a constant tightrope walk between desirability and impending putrefaction, making it a common source of food poisoning and disease. Then there was the delightful practice of adulteration. This wasn't necessarily about hygiene, but it certainly added to the overall quality, or lack thereof, of Roman food. It was common practice for unscrupulous vendors to add fillers or questionable ingredients to food to increase volume, disguise spoilage, or simply to make a cheaper product. Sand or dirt in flour, sawdust in bread, diluted wine, or even lead added to wine for sweetness. The list goes on. You weren't just eating food. You were eating a mystery blend of ingredients, some of which could be actively harmful. Finally, the ever-present water contamination. The same lead-laden water from the aqueducts and public fountains was used for cooking, washing produce, and preparing drinks. So even if your food was perfectly fresh, it might be washed in or cooked with water that was slowly poisoning you. The Roman kitchen, then, was less a place of culinary delight and more a bustling laboratory of bacterial growth and questionable chemical concoctions, making every bite a testament to the resilience of the Roman digestive system. When we talk about Roman housing, we're really talking about two wildly different experiences, each with its own peculiar flavor of grime and discomfort. On one end of the spectrum, you had the grand villa, the domus, for the truly wealthy. And on the other, the multi-story apartment blocks, the insulae, where the vast majority of Rome's teeming population resided. The domus offered relative cleanliness, but even this was a far cry from modern standards. Think courtyards that provided fresh air and natural light, and often access to private water via lead pipes, bringing their slow poison directly into their lavish homes. But even in these opulent abodes, issues like heating, smoke from braziers and wood fires without proper ventilation filling the air, and pest control were constant battles. Rats and mice still found their way in, and flies were an inescapable summer plague. So, while more spacious and better equipped, the domus was hardly a sterile environment. But let's be honest, most Romans didn't live in a domus. They lived in the insulae. These were the cramped, multi-story tenements, often poorly constructed, towering 5 or 6 stories high, housing hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. And it's here that Roman hygiene truly descends into a darkly comedic nightmare of shared squalor. Imagine a building without running water. Or, more accurately, without running water above the ground floor. Residents on upper floors had to carry water up multiple flights of stairs from public fountains, or rely on small, often unsanitary cisterns. This severely limited their ability to maintain personal cleanliness or proper household hygiene. And as for private toilets, forget about it. The vast majority of insulae dwellers had no private latrines. So, what did they do for waste disposal? Welcome to the infamous Roman chamber pot, and more specifically, the infamous Roman window. Residents of the insulae relied almost entirely on chamber pots, or lasanum, for their nightly needs. And once that pot was full, or morning arrived, the contents had to go somewhere. Since there were no internal plumbing systems on upper floors, and often no easy access to a public latrine, the most convenient, albeit utterly disgusting, solution was to simply empty the chamber pot directly out of the window onto the street below. A delightful rain of human efflua, you might call it, often aimed at unsuspecting pedestrians. Roman law even had provisions for compensation if you were hit by flying waste, proving it was a common enough occurrence to warrant legal precedent. Imagine walking down a narrow Roman alleyway, trying to avoid not just the accumulated garbage on the ground, but also the aerial bombardment of human excrement. It was truly a multi-sensory assault. And with such dense living conditions and such rudimentary waste disposal came the inevitable: pest infestations. Rodents, insects, and other delightful creatures weren't just occasional visitors, they were constant companions in these dense living spaces. Rats scurried through walls and floors, feasting on food scraps and whatever else they could find. Mice were everywhere. Cockroaches, flies, bedbugs, and fleas thrived in the warmth, the clutter, and the general organic richness of the insulae. It was a truly integrated ecosystem where humans and pests coexisted in intimate, often unhealthy proximity. Extermination wasn't an industry, it was a daily losing struggle. Finally, consider the air quality within these insulae. Smoke from cooking fires often unvented, would fill the cramped rooms, contributing to respiratory ailments. The pervasive stench from open sewers, street refuse, and the aerial chamber pot assaults would permeate every corner. And then there was the general urban pollution from craft activities and sheer population density. The air inside an insula would have been thick, stale, and laden with a cocktail of unpleasant odors and particulate matter. Living in a Roman insula was not merely about enduring physical discomfort, it was about living in a constant state of sensory overwhelm, a daily battle against dirt, disease, and the pervasive, inescapable reality of ancient urban squalor. Now, let's talk about disease in ancient Rome. If everything we've discussed so far sounds like a recipe for constant illness, you'd be absolutely right. The Romans lived in a perpetual epidemiological minefield, and their medical understanding, while making some practical strides, was fundamentally handicapped by a glaring lack of knowledge about germ theory. They had no idea that tiny, invisible organisms were responsible for most of their suffering. Instead, the prevailing medical understanding was based on the humors theory, derived from Greek medicine. This theory posited that the body was composed of 4 basic humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was achieved when these humors were in balance. Disease was merely an imbalance. Too much phlegm, you had a cold. Too much yellow bile, you were feverish. The solution, therefore, was to restore balance through purges, bleedings, emetics, and dietary adjustments. The idea that a microscopic pathogen could enter the body from dirty water, contaminated food, or unwashed hands was simply unthinkable. Disease was an internal disequilibrium, not an external invasion. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that any widespread public health initiatives beyond clean water supply and general drainage were severely limited in their effectiveness. You can't fight an enemy you don't know exists. This philosophical approach to medicine also meant that the field was rife with a fascinating, often terrifying, blend of genuine medical skill, quackery, and outright superstition. You had skilled surgeons, particularly in the Roman army, who could perform impressive, if incredibly brutal, operations. But then you had charlatans, street corner hawkers selling snake oil and dubious concoctions, and faith healers who relied on prayers, amulets, and magical rituals. Your chances of survival or recovery were often better without medical intervention, simply relying on the body's own immune system. Going to a Roman doctor was truly a leap of faith. A gamble on whether you'd encounter a competent healer or a well-meaning but ultimately harmful purveyor of ancient pseudoscience. Primitive surgery was, as mentioned, a brutal affair. Roman surgical instruments, some surprisingly sophisticated in design, scalpels, forceps, catheters, were typically made of bronze or iron. But without any concept of antisepsis, these instruments were reused, likely just wiped clean between patients, or perhaps rinsed in unsterile water. Every cut was a gamble, every surgery a biological experiment. Infection rates were incredibly high. Amputations, trepanations, drilling holes in the skull, and other invasive procedures were performed without anesthetics, leading to unimaginable pain and shock. The immediate cause of death was often not the injury or disease itself, but the rampant, untreatable infection that followed surgery. It was a terrifying reality where the cure could often be worse and more immediate than the ailment. Common ailments were, predictably, those associated with poor sanitation and lack of germ awareness. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, malaria, especially in the marshy areas around Rome, tuberculosis, and various parasitic infections were constant companions. Life was a relentless struggle against these endemic diseases, often compounded by malnutrition and chronic lead poisoning. Infant mortality was brutally high, with many children succumbing to preventable infections in their first years of life. The average Roman probably experienced a dizzying array of illnesses throughout their lifetime, each one a potential death sentence. So while the Romans built an empire of unparalleled grandeur, they did so on a foundation of constant human suffering, a silent toll exacted by a world without basic hygiene and a profound ignorance of the microscopic forces that truly governed health and disease. If you thought the general backdrop of daily disease was grim, let's talk about the big guns, the plagues. For Rome, and indeed for most ancient cities, devastating outbreaks of disease were not just a medieval phenomenon. They were a recurring nightmare, a constant, terrifying companion throughout their history. These were events that could decimate populations, collapse economies, and fundamentally reshape the course of empires. Rome wasn't immune. Its very nature as a densely populated, globally connected city made it a prime target. One particularly virulent and terrifying example was the plague of Justinian, which swept through the Eastern Roman, Byzantine, Empire starting in 541-542 AD. This was, in fact, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, preceding the Black Death by nearly 8 centuries. Its impact was catastrophic. Descriptions from contemporary historians like Procopius paint a horrifying picture. Sudden onset of fever, swollen lymph nodes, buboes in the groin and armpits, hallucinations, and rapid death. The death toll was staggering. Constantinople, the capital, was said to be losing thousands of people a day. Bodies piled up in the streets, left unburied due to the sheer volume of dead and the fear of contagion. Estimates suggest that it killed tens of millions of people across the Roman world and beyond, possibly reducing the world's population by as much as 15 to 20%. Imagine a world where roughly a fifth of everyone you knew simply vanished, quickly, agonizingly. The role of urban conditions in these epidemics is chillingly clear. Dense, unsanitary cities like Rome and Constantinople were ideal breeding grounds. Large populations living in close quarters, often with poor nutrition and already weakened immune systems, provided a perfect human reservoir for pathogens. Combined with constant trade routes, ships bringing grain, goods, and, unbeknownst to them, plague-carrying rats from distant lands, these cities became biological tinderboxes. The rats would disembark, their fleas carrying the deadly Yersinia pestis bacterium, and soon the plague would erupt, spreading like wildfire through the unhygienic streets and crowded tenements. The Roman obsession with importing exotic goods and maintaining vast trade networks, while economically beneficial, also inadvertently created the perfect superhighways for disease. The Roman response to these outbreaks was predictably often ineffective and desperate. Without any understanding of germ theory or contagion, their options were severely limited. Religious rituals, sacrifices to various gods to appease their wrath, and elaborate public prayers were common. Desperate flight from infected cities was also widespread, but this often simply spread the disease further into the countryside. Quarantines, when attempted, were rare, crude, and largely ineffective, as people still lacked the fundamental knowledge of how the disease was truly transmitted. People didn't understand that a flea bite was the culprit, or that rat control was key. Instead, they blamed divine wrath, evil spirits, or corrupted air, miasma, leading to futile remedies and a profound sense of helplessness. Praying to the gods was often the only treatment available, and it rarely worked. The constant threat of plague was a brutal reminder of Rome's fragility, a stark contrast to its imperial grandeur, and a terrifying glimpse into the unseen costs of empire. The Roman army, that epitome of discipline, organization, and engineering prowess, presents an interesting paradox when it comes to hygiene. On the one hand, these were fighting machines, meticulously trained, equipped, and provisioned. On the other, they were human beings, marching and fighting in often brutal conditions, constantly exposed to the very same disease vectors that plagued civilian life. While civilian Rome struggled with chaotic sanitation, the legionary life, out of sheer necessity, often demonstrated a surprising and relatively better grasp of practical camp hygiene. Legionary life was harsh. Endless marches, living in temporary camps, often in hostile territory, meant constant exposure to the elements and the myriad diseases that lurked in foreign lands. Soldiers faced not just enemy swords, but also the invisible enemy, disease. The construction of a temporary camp, the castra, was a marvel of military engineering, built with incredible speed and precision. And within this disciplined structure, camp hygiene was given a surprisingly high priority. Out of necessity, mind you, not out of any advanced medical understanding. A sick army is a defeated army. The need for latrines, fresh water, and waste disposal in these temporary settlements was paramount. Roman camps would feature carefully dug latrines, often positioned downwind and downstream from the living quarters and water sources. These were simple trenches, sometimes with seats, but their strategic placement was crucial for preventing the spread of dysentery and other fecal-oral diseases that could quickly incapacitate an entire legion. Water sources were carefully guarded and prioritized, often sourced from wells or purified from local rivers, though their purification methods were rudimentary. Waste disposal was more organized than in civilian towns, with designated areas for refuse and, ideally, regular burning or burying of trash. This organized approach to sanitation, driven by military discipline and the pragmatic need to keep soldiers fit for battle, often made Roman camps surprisingly healthier than many contemporary civilian settlements, a surprising island of organized cleanliness in a sea of rustic muck. Despite these efforts, disease remained a greater killer of soldiers than battle wounds. Dysentery, often contracted from contaminated water or food, was a perpetual scourge, weakening and often killing more men than any enemy army. Camp fever, various forms of typhus or malaria, would sweep through legions, particularly in marshy regions or during prolonged sieges. Malaria, a constant threat in many parts of the Roman Empire, would debilitate entire units, making them vulnerable. Even with relatively better camp hygiene, the sheer exposure, the stress, and the often poor nutrition inherent in campaign life meant that soldiers were constantly battling these invisible foes. A Roman legionary might survive a dozen battles, only to succumb to a common stomach bug. Medical provisions within the army were, again, relatively sophisticated for the time. Army doctors, or medici, were trained and equipped with a range of instruments. Field hospitals, or valetudinaria, were established in larger, permanent camps and behind the lines during major campaigns. These were often organized, clean structures with individual rooms for patients. While still limited by the overall medical knowledge of the era, no anesthetics, no antibiotics, no germ theory, these army medical facilities were often better equipped and staffed than their civilian counterparts, pushing advancements in surgery and wound care out of sheer necessity. Finally, the challenge of ensuring clean food and water on campaign was immense. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles, and protecting perishable goods from spoilage and contamination was a constant struggle. So, while the Roman army could build impressive infrastructure and enforce strict discipline, they were ultimately at the mercy of the microscopic world, fighting an enemy they couldn't see, one that often proved more deadly than any barbarian horde. If adult Roman life was a constant battle against grime and disease, then childhood was a veritable gauntlet, a profoundly precarious start to existence, where hygiene was often an afterthought in the face of sheer survival. Infant mortality rates in ancient Rome were brutally high, a stark and sobering reality. Many children did not survive their first year, succumbing to a myriad of preventable diseases that we now easily manage. The Roman nursery was less about lullabies and more about sheer endurance, a place where survival itself was the primary achievement. Swaddling was a widespread practice, particularly for infants. Babies would be tightly wrapped in strips of cloth, designed to keep their limbs straight, provide warmth, and supposedly protect them from harm. Debates over its benefits and drawbacks have persisted for centuries. While it might have offered some comfort and a sense of security, it also presented significant hygiene challenges. Imagine an infant tightly swaddled, inevitably soiling their wraps. The frequency of changing, the thoroughness of cleaning, and the availability of fresh, clean cloths would have varied wildly based on the family's means and the attentiveness of caregivers. A soiled, damp swaddle could quickly lead to skin irritation, rashes, and infections, turning a protective practice into a potential health hazard in a world without antiseptic wipes or disposable diapers. Breastfeeding versus wet nurses was another crucial aspect of infant care, and one with significant hygiene implications. While many mothers breastfed, wealthy Roman families often employed wet nurses, slave women who would feed the infant. This practice introduced a potential for disease transmission from the wet nurse to the child, especially if the wet nurse was herself ill or if her own living conditions were unsanitary. Additionally, the quality of a wet nurse's diet and general health would directly impact the child's nutrition and well-being. Furthermore, the use of animal milk or gruels for feeding, especially if prepared with contaminated water or in unhygienic conditions, could also be a significant source of infant illness and mortality. Childhood diseases were a constant, devastating presence. Infants and young children with undeveloped immune systems were constantly exposed to a torrent of infections from their environment. Measles, mumps, rubella, whooping cough, and most terrifyingly, dysentery and other diarrheal diseases were rampant. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, rudimentary food preparation, and general lack of awareness about contagion meant that children were particularly vulnerable. A common cold could quickly escalate into a fatal respiratory infection. A stomach bug could lead to rapid dehydration and death. Treatment options were severely limited, often involving superstitious remedies, ineffective potions, or simply prayer. The sheer number of children who simply did not make it to adulthood paints a grim picture of the brutal realities of Roman childhood, a stark reminder that even the most powerful empire could not shield its youngest members from the relentless assault of disease and unhygienic living. It's important to understand that when Romans thought of cleanliness, they often weren't thinking in terms of germ theory or microscopic pathogens. Their concept of purity was frequently tied to religion, ritual, and a symbolic state of being rather than physical sanitation. This was a different kind of clean, a spiritual rather than a strictly physical hygiene, and it rarely intersected with what we would consider effective public health measures. Ritual purity was paramount before engaging in religious observances, sacrifices, or entering sacred spaces. Before offering prayers or making sacrifices to the gods, Romans would perform various ablutions, washing their hands, face, or sometimes their entire body. This was meant to purify them in a spiritual sense, to make them ritually acceptable to the deities. But these washings were often symbolic rather than thorough cleansing. A quick dip of the hands in a basin of water, a splash of water on the face, or a perfunctory rinse was usually sufficient. It wasn't about scrubbing away dirt or killing germs. It was about symbolically removing impurities that might offend the gods or invalidate the ritual. The water used might not even be particularly clean, but its ritual significance was what mattered. Sacrifices themselves were a fascinating and rather messy blend of ritual and real-world biology. Animals were slaughtered, their entrails examined, and then often burned. This process, while religious, was also a public spectacle involving blood, animal waste, and the lingering smell of burning flesh. While some efforts might have been made to keep the sacrificial area presentable, the underlying reality was one of biological mess, often at odds with any notion of modern hygiene. Priests and supplicants would perform their duties, often with bare hands, in environments that would make a health inspector faint. The Vestal Virgins, arguably the most important female religious figures in Rome, embodied an extreme form of ritual purity. Their entire lives were dedicated to maintaining the sacred flame of Vesta and performing rituals essential for Rome's well-being. This demanding job came with incredibly strict rules of purity and chastity. A single slip-up, a loss of virginity, could mean being buried alive, a particularly gruesome consequence for a religious infraction. Their purity was both spiritual and physical, a symbol of Rome's moral integrity. While they would have practiced personal hygiene, their cleanliness was less about avoiding disease and more about maintaining an unsullied state required for their sacred duties. They were literally guardians of Rome's sacred cleanliness, a profound and weighty responsibility. The intersection, or rather the stark lack thereof, between these religious beliefs and effective public health was profound. While the Romans built impressive aqueducts and sewers, these were driven by practical needs for water supply and waste drainage, not by a germ theory understanding of disease. There was no religious edict to boil water, no ritual requirement to quarantine the sick, no divine instruction to wash surgical instruments. The spiritual realm and the physical realm of disease prevention remained largely separate. You could be ritually pure, having performed all the necessary ablutions and sacrifices, and still contract a devastating plague from contaminated water. The gods, it seems, were concerned with your soul, not your bacterial load. This fundamental disconnect meant that for all their piety and ritualistic observance, Roman society remained highly vulnerable to the very real biological threats that permeated their daily lives. Rome wasn't just a human city. It was a bustling, thriving metropolis for every creature great and small, especially the small and disgusting. The urban landscape was an intricate web of interspecies cohabitation, a symphony of scurrying, buzzing, and scuttling that often dictated the terms of daily hygiene. The omnipresent rats, mice, dogs, cats, flies, and other insects weren't merely an annoyance. They were an integral part of the Roman experience, active participants in the spread of disease and the overall unsanitary conditions. Let's start with the urban wildlife. Rats and mice were everywhere, absolutely everywhere. They thrived in the unmanaged waste, the abundant food scraps, the warm, dark nooks and crannies of insulae, granaries, and markets. Imagine the rustle of rodents in the walls, the sight of them scurrying across streets at dusk, or, more horrifyingly, making an unwelcome appearance in your kitchen or, as we've discussed, your latrine. Dogs, often strays, roamed the streets, scavenging for food, adding their own waste to the already overflowing gutters. Cats, while perhaps less numerous, would also be present, often performing a useful, albeit insufficient, service in keeping the rodent population somewhat in check. These animals were not just a nuisance, they were integral to the daily life and daily filth of Rome. Crucially, these rodents and insects were, unknowingly, the primary carriers of disease, the silent vectors for some of the most devastating scourges that afflicted Roman society. Rats, harboring fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, were the primary vector for bubonic plague, as devastatingly demonstrated by the plague of Justinian. Mice could spread salmonella and other diseases. Flies, buzzing from rotting garbage to open food stalls to human skin, were highly effective in transmitting bacterial diseases like dysentery and typhoid. Mosquitoes, especially in the marshy areas surrounding Rome, were prolific carriers of malaria, a debilitating disease that constantly weakened the populace. It was an invisible enemy, one that the Romans, lacking any understanding of germ theory, were utterly powerless to combat effectively. Their coexistence with these critters was, in fact, a death sentence for many. Pest control, in a modern sense, was virtually non-existent. There were some rudimentary methods, certainly. Traps for rats and mice, often simple snares or pits. Poisoning, perhaps with toxic substances like arsenic, but this was dangerous and often indiscriminately applied. For insects, burning incense or aromatic herbs might have offered some temporary reprieve, but it was largely a losing battle. Extermination wasn't an industry, it was a daily struggle, a personal skirmish against an unending tide of creepy crawlies. The sheer scale of the problem, combined with the lack of understanding of disease transmission, meant that Romans largely just lived with the problem, resigned to sharing their city, their homes, and even their bodies with these vectors of illness. The dark side of pet ownership also falls into this category. While Romans certainly kept pets, dogs, cats, birds, the health risks associated with living in close quarters with animals, particularly without modern understanding of zoonotic diseases, were significant. Fleas and ticks from pets could easily transfer to humans, carrying their own array of diseases. Pet waste in homes or gardens, if not properly managed, added to the overall unsanitary environment. So, while a loyal dog or a playful cat might have brought companionship, they also brought a host of biological baggage. Rome wasn't just dirty, it was a truly wild ecosystem, a testament to nature's relentless ability to thrive even in the most profoundly unsanitary human environments, often at humanity's expense. Let's take a moment, if you dare, to close your eyes, or perhaps just pinch your nose, and truly immerse ourselves in the probable sensory experience of walking through ancient Rome. Because while the sights of monumental arches and bustling forums were undoubtedly impressive, the overarching, inescapable reality was the smell. Rome was, by all accounts and historical estimates, a city of stench, a complex, layered olfactory assault that would overwhelm modern senses and fundamentally reshape your understanding of bad odor. This wasn't just a faint whiff, it was a pervasive, all-encompassing miasma that clung to everything and everyone. Let's dissect this glorious bouquet of ancient urban decay, starting with the most prominent contributor, human waste. We've talked about the open sewers, the chamber pots emptied from windows, the public latrines. All of these contributed to a constant, powerful background odor of feces and urine. Imagine walking past an open sewer grate on a hot summer's day, or navigating a street where yesterday's chamber pot contents have dried and mingled with the dust. This was not an occasional incident. This was the daily reality. The pervasive ammonia from urine, the distinct pungency of excrement, it was a foundational layer of the Roman olfactory experience. Then, animal waste. Rome was a city teeming with animals. Horses pulled carts and chariots, donkeys carried burdens, sheep and goats were driven through for market, and dogs roamed freely. All of these animals produced prodigious amounts of dung, which, in the absence of organized street cleaning, would accumulate, mix with the dust and mud, and contribute its own earthy, pungent aroma to the streetscape. The smell of horse dung, drying and decaying in the sun, was as common as the sound of chariot wheels. And don't forget the sacrificial animals, slaughtered in temples, their blood and entrails adding to the general biological richness. Garbage, of course, was another major player. The uncollected refuse, the rotting food scraps, the general detritus piled in the streets and alleyways would attract flies and ferment in the heat. The smell of decay, of putrefaction, of old food mingled with other trash would have been constant and pervasive. It was a giant, slow-cooking organic stew, perpetually releasing its delightful aromas into the Roman air. But wait, there's more. Industrial smells contributed their own unique notes to this Roman symphony of stench. Tanneries, for example, which processed animal hides, used urine and other foul-smelling chemicals, releasing truly noxious odors into the surrounding areas. Dye works, with their vats of fermenting vegetable matter, added their own distinct chemical tang. And perhaps most famously, the production of garum, the beloved Roman fermented fish sauce. Imagine vats of fish guts allowed to rot and ferment in the sun for weeks or months, producing a rich, savory, and incredibly pungent aroma. The smell of fermented fish guts, a true Roman delicacy, was also an olfactory assault, powerful enough to be relegated to specific, usually downwind, areas of the city. And finally, body odor, with bathing practices that involved scraping rather than truly washing with soap, and laundry practices that used urine and sulfur, the human element contributed its own undeniable aroma. Lack of daily, full-body washing, limited effective deodorants, and heavy wool clothing meant that personal body odor, mingling with the applied perfumes, which, as we discussed, often just masked rather than eliminated, was simply part of the package. So, imagine all of this, all at once. The smell of Rome was a complex, multi-layered beast, a testament to a world utterly devoid of modern sanitation and our delicate sensibilities. It was a smell of power, of life, of struggle, and, above all, of pervasive, unavoidable grime. In a city defined by its multifaceted bouquet of odors, the question naturally arises, who smelled worse? While the general background funk of Roman life was unavoidable for everyone, stench, like so many things in Rome, had a social hierarchy. Class and odor were intimately intertwined, serving as subtle yet powerful indicators of status. The wealthy, of course, had options. They could afford more frequent visits to the baths, though, as we've noted, clean was a relative term there. They could employ slaves to oil and scrape them more thoroughly, or to carry fresh water to their homes. Crucially, they could afford an abundance of perfumes, scented oils, and exotic unguents, which, while not eliminating body odor, certainly allowed them to smell more expensively. Imagine a patrician, freshly scraped, slathered in jasmine and frankincense, their expensive wool toga having just returned from the fuller's and thus imbued with a subtle urine-sulfur tang. They still stank, just in a more refined, chemically complex way. Their odors were masked, layered, and carefully curated, a performance of fragrant wealth against the backdrop of pervasive city-wide funk. The working class, the laborers, the slaves, and the poor bore the full burden of ancient Roman odor. Their lives were physically demanding, often spent outdoors or in dirty workshops. They had less access to public baths or less time to frequent them, and certainly couldn't afford luxurious perfumes. Their clothing, often simple tunics of coarse wool or linen, would be worn for longer periods between washings, absorbing sweat, grime, and the odors of their labor. Imagine the smell of a fishmonger, a tanner, a potter, or a construction worker. Their natural body odor, combined with the smells of their trades and the pervasive urban stench, would have been strong, distinct, and unavoidable. They were perpetually grimy and smelly, not out of choice, but out of necessity and circumstance. Their odor was honest, earthy, and frankly, quite pungent, a direct reflection of their harsh daily realities. Roman writers, those often snobbish commentators on society, occasionally provided glimpses into this social stigma of stench. They would sometimes comment on offensive odors, highlighting societal awareness and judgment of those who didn't manage their personal aromas well. A person who smelled particularly foul might be ridiculed or seen as uncouth. However, it's important to remember their frame of reference. Their foul might be our mildly unpleasant. The baseline for acceptable odor was significantly higher than ours. So, while they might have judged a truly egregious personal stench, they were also living in a world where everyone carried a distinct, pervasive aroma that would send modern nostrils reeling. Ultimately, despite the class differences and the various strategies for masking or mitigating offensive odors, the general background smell of Roman life was unavoidable for everyone. Rich or poor, senator or slave, you breathed the same air, scented with human waste, animal dung, industrial fumes, and the collective body odor of a million souls. The social stigma was perhaps less about whether you smelled and more about how you smelled, whether you had the means to apply a fragrant veneer or if your natural, unadorned effluvium was simply too raw, too honest, too unpleasantly direct for polite society. In the grand tapestry of Roman life, odor was just another thread, albeit a particularly pungent and omnipresent one, weaving together the rich and the poor in a shared, unavoidable miasma. Given all the horrors we've described, you might be thinking, surely the Romans tried to do something, and indeed they did. While lacking germ theory, the Romans were pragmatic engineers and administrators, and they understood that a city needed some basic infrastructure and rules to function. Thus, we see the rise of public health, albeit a limited and often ineffective version, through various Roman legislation and attempts at enforcement. These were early attempts at urban management, well-intentioned laws, often ignored faster than a speed limit in modern Rome. Early regulations regarding street cleaning and waste disposal certainly existed. There were laws forbidding the dumping of refuse directly onto public roads, especially main thoroughfares. Building codes sometimes stipulated proper drainage or required waste pits. The very existence of the aqueducts and sewers demonstrates a societal commitment to civic infrastructure designed to manage water and waste. But as we've seen, the sheer scale of Rome, combined with the lack of understanding of disease transmission, often rendered these efforts woefully inadequate. A law on paper is one thing. Its consistent enforcement across a sprawling, densely populated metropolis is quite another. The officials responsible for overseeing public works and general morality were the aediles and censors. These were the city managers, the urban planners, the health inspectors, in a loose sense, of ancient Rome. Their responsibilities were vast, ranging from maintaining temples and public buildings to regulating markets, managing traffic, and, occasionally, attempting to enforce sanitation rules. An aedile might indeed issue an edict for a specific street to be cleaned, or levy a fine against someone emptying a chamber pot directly onto a passerby. But with only a handful of officials overseeing a city of 1 million people, their capacity for widespread, consistent enforcement was severely limited. They were constantly battling a tide of human indifference and the logistical challenges of an unwieldy urban environment. The challenge of scale was truly Rome's nemesis in the realm of public hygiene. A massive population, sprawling over hills and valleys, without effective communication or transportation networks for waste collection, made a truly clean city an impossibility. Imagine trying to coordinate a weekly garbage pickup for the entirety of modern New York City, but with ox carts, human labor, and no proper landfill. The task was monumental, and the resources and understanding simply weren't there to achieve comprehensive sanitation. Regulations existed, but their impact was often localized and temporary, quickly subsumed by the relentless generation of urban detritus. Crucially, the focus on water and sewers, while groundbreaking, was primarily for convenience, public display, and drainage, not necessarily germ theory prevention. The aqueducts provided ample water for drinking and bathing, making life more comfortable and impressive. The sewers drained the city, preventing it from literally drowning in its own effluent, and preventing stagnant pools where mosquitoes, and thus malaria, could breed. These were enormous public health benefits, certainly, but they were a byproduct of practical engineering and urban planning, not a targeted attack on disease at its microbial source. The Romans, in their pragmatic brilliance, built what they could see and manage, flowing water and disappearing waste. The unseen world of bacteria and viruses, the true architects of their widespread suffering, remained entirely beyond their comprehension, and thus beyond the reach of their admirable, yet ultimately limited, public health efforts. Death, as it always does, brought its own unique set of hygiene challenges in ancient Rome. The rituals surrounding the deceased were elaborate, often public, and, to our modern sensibilities, rife with the potential for lingering contamination. When a Roman died, the immediate aftermath typically involved preparing the body at home. The corpse would be washed, anointed with oils and perfumes to mask the inevitable odors of decomposition, which would begin fairly quickly in the Roman heat, and dressed in fine clothes. This process, often carried out by family members or designated slaves, meant intimate contact with the deceased, potentially exposing the living to whatever pathogens had claimed the life. Funeral processions were often grand affairs, particularly for the wealthy and influential. The body, sometimes laid out on an open bier, would be carried through the streets, accompanied by mourners, musicians, and professional lamenters. These parades, while a show of status and respect, were also, in essence, a public display of a decaying body. In the heat, the decomposition process would continue, attracting flies that could then transfer pathogens from the corpse to the living. Imagine a slow procession, perhaps lasting for hours, making its way through crowded streets, leaving a subtle, unsettling biological trail in its wake. It was a testament to Roman tradition, but also a potential vector for disease spread within the bustling urban environment. Both burial and cremation were practiced in ancient Rome, and each presented its own set of hygiene considerations. Cremation, where the body was burned on a funeral pyre, offered a more sanitary method of disposal. The intense heat would destroy pathogens, leaving only ashes. However, the pyres themselves, often located outside the city walls, could still be sources of localized air pollution and, if not managed properly, could attract scavengers. Burial, on the other hand, while perhaps less visually dramatic, carried a different set of risks. Cemeteries, or necropoli, were typically located outside the city, but if not managed properly, or if overcrowded, could still be sources of contamination. Decomposing bodies release fluids and gases, and if groundwater was contaminated by burial sites, it could lead to the spread of disease, particularly in areas reliant on wells. The catacombs, those vast subterranean networks of tunnels lined with burial niches, represent another facet of Roman death rituals. These were mass burial sites, often for Christian or Jewish communities, and they highlight the sheer volume of bodies that needed to be interred. While underground, the sheer density of decomposing bodies in often unventilated spaces could contribute to poor air quality, and, potentially, the accumulation of pathogens. For those who visited the catacombs for ritual or mourning, the environment, while sacred, was also one of prolonged exposure to the biological aftermath of death. Finally, the less savory aspects, grave robbing and the disturbance of burial sites. These acts, driven by greed or desperation, could expose pathogens long after the initial internment. Disturbing ancient graves, particularly those that might have housed victims of epidemics, could release dormant bacteria or spores, posing a renewed health risk to those who disturbed them. So, even in death, the Romans contended with the lingering contamination that defined so much of their life, a final, grim chapter in the empire's ongoing struggle against the unseen forces of disease and decay. It's tempting to assume that a society as advanced and thoughtful as Rome would have a sophisticated philosophical underpinning for its hygiene practices. But the reality is, Roman philosophy, while grappling with profound questions of ethics, morality, and the good life, rarely dove deep into the specifics of bodily hygiene in a way that aligns with our modern understanding. Their discussions of the body and cleanliness were often more concerned with moderation, self-control, and the display of civic virtue, rather than germ avoidance or the pursuit of antiseptic purity. Consider the Stoics and Epicureans, two of the most influential philosophical schools in Rome. Stoicism, with its emphasis on virtue, reason, and indifference to pain and pleasure, might have viewed excessive concern with physical cleanliness as a distraction from higher pursuits. A Stoic might counsel moderation in bathing, seeing it as a necessary function, but not something to be overly indulged in. The body was a vessel, something to be maintained for the sake of duty and reason, but not pampered. Epicureans, while pursuing pleasure, defined it as the absence of pain and disturbance. This might translate to preferring a clean, comfortable body, but not an obsessive pursuit of sterility. Neither school would have remotely conceived of a link between invisible microbes and disease, making their cleanliness fundamentally different from ours. Seneca, a prominent Stoic philosopher, offers some insights. He often mused on the importance of moderation in all things, including bathing. He might have advocated for regular, but not excessive, visits to the baths, perhaps viewing the boisterous, often indulgent atmosphere of the public baths as a potential distraction or even a moral hazard. He probably just thought everyone else was too loud in the caldarium, we might sarcastically conclude. His concerns would have been more about temperance, about avoiding the decadence that could accompany excessive self-indulgence, rather than the practicalities of physical cleanliness for health reasons. For him, bathing was about maintaining a healthy body for a healthy mind, not about Pliny the Elder, a prodigious naturalist and encyclopedist, provides another window into Roman thought, albeit one more focused on practical remedies and natural history than abstract philosophy. His massive work, Natural History, is replete with medical lore, folk remedies, and often bizarre prescriptions for various ailments, many of which involve animal parts, herbs, and dubious ingredients. While his aim was to compile useful knowledge, His work underscores the lack of scientific rigor and the reliance on observation and tradition rather than empirical experimentation. He would catalog the uses of various plants for skin conditions or the supposed benefits of certain waters, but always without the crucial missing link of germ theory. His understanding of cleanliness was rooted in visible effects and traditional beliefs, not microscopic realities. Ultimately, Roman philosophy generally adopted a pragmatic approach to the body and its maintenance. The emphasis was on practical living, civic duty, and the pursuit of a well-ordered life. Bodily purity, when discussed, was more often for its own sake, as a sign of respectability or as a component of spiritual ritual, rather than as a means to prevent illness through bacterial control. They desired comfort, certainly, and they valued the social aspects of bathing and grooming. But the abstract notions of bodily purity that preoccupied some later religious traditions, or the scientific purity we now chase, were largely absent. For the Romans, a clean body was simply one that was presentable, functional, and not overtly offensive to the senses. The unseen costs of their pragmatic approach, however, were profound. While we focused heavily on the bustling, grimy heart of Rome, it's crucial to remember that the Roman Empire was vast, encompassing myriad cities, towns, and rural communities, each with its own unique approach to hygiene. Provincial hygiene, therefore, was a patchwork of local variations, often starkly different from the grand stale of the capital. Leaving the Eternal City meant leaving behind some of its monumental sanitation infrastructure, but also, paradoxically, some of its most concentrated filth. Smaller towns and villas, away from the intense population density of Rome, often enjoyed cleaner air and less overwhelming sources of pollution. While they might not have had the dozen aqueducts of Rome, many significant towns across the empire boasted their own baths and water systems, albeit on a smaller scale. These provincial baths were often quite impressive, miniature versions of their Roman counterparts, providing similar social and hygienic functions for local populations. Wealthy villa owners in the countryside might have had even more direct access to freshwater sources, and their smaller households would generate less waste, making domestic hygiene somewhat easier to manage than in an insula. So, in some ways, life outside the capital could be a tad less overwhelming on the sensory front. Rural life, however, presented its own unique challenges. Farming communities, scattered across the vast Roman landscape, often had limited access to organized water systems. Wells and local rivers were the primary sources, making water collection a daily chore. Animal waste, from livestock kept in close proximity to homes, was a constant reality. Sanitation was often a matter of self-sufficiency. Basic pit latrines, composting of organic waste, and reliance on natural processes to break down refuse. While rural areas might not have suffered from the concentrated stench of an urban center, they faced the constant threat of contamination from animal waste, poor water sources, and rudimentary personal hygiene, particularly for those engaged in physically demanding agricultural labor. It was a different kind of grime, perhaps more earthy and less industrially complex, but equally challenging in its own way. Paradoxically, some of the most consistent and organized examples of relatively good hygiene in the Roman world could be found in its military forts. Legionary encampments, whether temporary or permanent, were models of efficiency and discipline. Out of sheer necessity, a sick army is a defeated army, the Romans implemented strict hygiene protocols in their forts. Carefully constructed latrines, segregated waste disposal areas, and strict rules regarding water usage and sources were standard. These forts often had their own water systems, sometimes small aqueducts or wells, and their own, albeit smaller, bathhouses for the soldiers. The discipline of the army translated into a surprisingly organized approach to sanitation, making military forts a remarkable island of relative cleanliness in a sea of rustic muck. They were pragmatic, understanding that disease could decimate their ranks more effectively than any enemy sword. So, while Rome itself was a marvel of engineering, its concentrated population and complex social dynamics created a unique and often overwhelming environment of filth. Away from the capital, hygiene standards varied, sometimes for the better in smaller, less dense communities, and sometimes for the worse in isolated rural areas. The Roman Empire, in its vastness, was a testament to both grand ambition and the ever-present, grinding reality of adapting human life to fundamental biological challenges, whether through engineering marvels or sheer, disciplined pragmatism. Having ventured into the realm of Roman medicine, let's now take a closer, albeit wincing, look at the tools of the trade. Roman surgical instruments, as revealed by archaeological finds, were surprisingly sophisticated in their design and variety. Scalpels, forceps, bone drills, catheters, specula, a formidable array of bronze and iron implements designed for specific surgical tasks. They demonstrated a practical understanding of anatomy and surgical technique that often belied their lack of fundamental medical knowledge. These were not crude, blunt objects. They were often finely crafted, sometimes even elegant tools, created to perform delicate or invasive procedures. But here's where the elegance ends and the horror truly begins: the complete and utter lack of sterilization. Without any concept of germ theory, the Romans had no idea that invisible pathogens could cause infection. Instruments were reused, patient after patient, operation after operation, without proper cleaning. At best, they might be wiped clean with a cloth, or perhaps rinsed in unsterile water. The idea of boiling instruments or using antiseptic solutions was centuries away. Every cut was a gamble, every surgery a biological experiment with predictably grim outcomes. A surgeon might skillfully remove a tumor, only for the patient to die days later from a raging infection introduced by the very tools meant to save them. The instruments themselves became vectors of disease, passing bacteria from one patient to the next, turning a healing attempt into a literal death sentence. The Roman army, as we've noted, was a crucible for medical advancements. The constant stream of battle wounds and injuries forced military doctors to innovate and refine surgical techniques and instruments. Many of the sophisticated tools we find were developed or perfected in a military context, driven by the pragmatic need to keep soldiers alive and on the battlefield. The army provided an environment for systematic observation and practice, leading to some of the more advanced surgical tools and procedures. For instance, the invention of specialized instruments for extracting arrows or performing battlefield amputations highlights this grim necessity. Amputation and cautery were common, brutal, but often life-saving procedures in a world without antibiotics. Faced with a severely infected limb or a wound that wouldn't heal, amputation was often the only recourse to prevent gangrene and systemic infection. These procedures were performed without any form of anesthetic beyond perhaps a strong drink or a blunt blow to the head, making them agonizingly painful and traumatizing. Cautery, the practice of burning tissue to stop bleeding or seal wounds, was also widely used, either with heated instruments or chemical agents. While effective for hemorrhage control, It inflicted immense pain and tissue damage, again without any thought to sterilizing the cautery iron or the resulting wound. The Roman medical kit, then, was a testament to human ingenuity and a horrifying glimpse into a world where pain was an inescapable part of healing, and where every surgical intervention carried the very real risk of introducing the fatal infection it sought to prevent. Truly, a glimpse into pain. If Roman surgery was a dance with the devil, then their pharmacopoeia was a chaotic, often comical, attempt to appease the gods of illness with a bewildering array of remedies. Without a scientific understanding of disease, Roman physicians and folk healers cobbled together a vast collection of herbs, animal parts, magical potions, and pure placebos, creating a medical landscape that was both fascinating and frequently ineffective. Natural remedies formed the backbone of Roman medicine. A wide array of herbs, plants, and even animal parts were used for medicinal purposes. Elderflower for colds, willow bark, containing salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, for pain, chamomile for sleep. Some of these had genuine therapeutic properties, but this was often mixed with less effective or downright bizarre ingredients. Crushed earthworms for fever, pigeon droppings for baldness, gladiatorial sweat for beauty, or various animal organs for specific ailments. The logic was often based on sympathetic magic or tradition rather than empirical evidence. So while you might get a genuinely helpful herbal tea, you could just as easily be prescribed a delightful poultice of goat dung, hoping for a miracle. Magical potions, incantations, charms, and superstitious beliefs were inextricably intertwined with medical practice. When scientific understanding fails, superstition often fills the void. Illness was frequently attributed to divine displeasure, evil spirits, or curses, leading to an array of non-medical cures. Amulets worn to ward off disease, incantations whispered over sickbeds, or specific rituals performed at temples were common. Physicians might prescribe a specific herb, but also advise a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of medicine. When in doubt, sacrifice a chicken and hope for the best. Because what's the worst that could happen? It often meant that prayer and superstition were considered as, or even more, effective than physical remedies, leaving the patient truly at the mercy of chance. Perhaps most alarmingly, many Roman remedies contained poisonous ingredients. Without an understanding of toxicology, substances like lead, mercury, or arsenic were sometimes incorporated into potions or balms, either accidentally or in the mistaken belief that their potent effects were curative. Imagine being prescribed a remedy for a skin ailment that contained lead, slowly poisoning you as it supposedly healed your rash. The cure, in many cases, was often worse than the disease, leading to chronic illness or even death. The line between medicine and poison was often perilously thin, and many Romans likely suffered long-term health consequences from their well-intentioned but ultimately toxic cures. The status of the physician varied wildly. Some were highly respected specialists, often Greek-trained, who commanded high fees and treated the elite. Others were street corner quacks, peddling miracle cures to the unsuspecting masses. The lack of formal licensing or standardized training meant that anyone could set up shop as a healer. This created a highly unregulated and dangerous medical marketplace, where patients had little way of discerning between genuine skill and outright fraud. The Roman pharmacopoeia, then, was a fascinating, often horrifying, testament to human desperation in the face of illness. A chaotic blend of genuine botanical knowledge, mystical belief, and profoundly dangerous practices, all delivered with varying degrees of competence and care. Let's take a peek inside the Roman kitchen, shall we? Because while the Romans were known for their lavish banquets and sophisticated dining, the actual preparation of food, particularly for the common citizen, was often a culinary adventure fraught with unsanitation. Forget gleaming stainless steel and sterile surfaces. Think open flames, curious pests, and a fundamental ignorance of food safety. Roman kitchens, especially in insulae or smaller homes, were typically small, poorly ventilated spaces. Often open to the elements or poorly sealed, they were a magnet for flies, mice, and rats, all eager to sample the ingredients. Smoke from cooking fires would fill the room, coating surfaces in a greasy film and contributing to poor air quality. Without modern ventilation, the kitchen would have been perpetually smoky and filled with the lingering odors of past meals and, inevitably, the distinct smell of rodent droppings. It was a bustling, often chaotic environment where cleanliness was a secondary concern to simply getting food on the table. Cooking utensils were made of bronze, iron, or pottery. While durable, their cleaning practices were rudimentary. Imagine scrubbing a greasy bronze pot with abrasive sand or ash, then rinsing it with unsterile water. Without soap or effective detergents, a truly deep clean was hard to achieve. Utensils likely harbored bacteria from previous uses, creating a continuous cycle of recontamination. Wooden cutting boards, porous and difficult to sanitize, would have been a festering ground for pathogens, especially after preparing raw meat or fish. Every surface, every tool, was a potential vector for the transmission of foodborne illness. Food storage was another major hurdle. The concept of refrigeration was, of course, millennia away. Romans relied heavily on traditional preservation methods, salting meat and fish, drying fruits and vegetables, and pickling. Cellars might offer some cooling for wines and some perishables, but fresh ingredients had to be consumed quickly. Imagine attempting to store fresh meat in the Roman heat, trying to keep it from spoiling before it could be cooked. This challenge meant a constant race against time and decay, with food often being consumed just before or even as it began to turn. The risk of ingesting spoiled food was a daily reality, a thrilling game of bacterial roulette with every meal, and, of course, the water for cooking. This often came from the same public fountains or lead-piped supplies that supplied drinking water. So even if your ingredients were perfectly fresh and your utensils, by some miracle, clean, the very water you used to wash vegetables, boil grains, or mix drinks could be contaminated with lead, bacteria, or other pollutants. Boiling would kill some pathogens, but not all, and certainly wouldn't remove lead. It was a pervasive issue, one that undermined even the most diligent attempts at food preparation. Finally, consider the kitchen's slave's burden. For wealthy households, the kitchen was often the domain of slaves, tasked with the arduous and often unhygienic tasks of food preparation, cooking, cleaning, and waste disposal. These individuals, often working in cramped, hot, and unsanitary conditions, might themselves be ill or lacking in personal hygiene, further contributing to the risk of food contamination. Their labor was essential, but their conditions highlight the dark side of Roman culinary life, where the pursuit of a lavish banquet often came at the cost of both the slave's well-being and the diner's health. The Roman kitchen, then, was less a place of gastronomic delight and more a bustling, often unsanitary, laboratory of culinary adventure. We've already touched upon Roman perfumes as a mark of luxury, but it's crucial to understand their deeper, darker role in ancient Roman life. Beyond merely being pleasant scents, these perfumes and aromatics were a fundamental necessity, a desperate, often futile, attempt to combat the overwhelming, multi-layered smells of Roman cities and Roman bodies. They weren't just for aesthetic pleasure, they were a critical element in the daily war against malodor. Oils and unguents were extensively used. Perfumed oils, made from floral essences like rose, jasmine, and lily, or from exotic resins and spices, were applied directly to the body, mixed into hair, and even used to imbue clothing with a temporary fragrance. Imagine the daily ritual. After a bath, which, as we know, was not a sterilizing experience, you'd slather yourself in these strong, potent oils, hoping to create a fragrant barrier against the onslaught of city smells and your own lingering body odor. These weren't subtle, delicate fragrances. They needed to be robust, capable of competing with the pervasive odors of human waste, animal dung, and decaying garbage. So, while you might smell of roses, it was a very loud rose, fighting a losing battle against a far more powerful, offensive symphony of smells. Incense and other aromatics were also used liberally, not just in religious temples, but in homes and public spaces. Burning frankincense, myrrh, or other fragrant resins was believed to purify the air, to dispel miasmas, the ancient belief that disease was caused by bad air, or at the least, to make the air smell less terrible. Imagine walking into a wealthy Roman domus, where incense burners were constantly smoldering, their sweet, smoky tendrils attempting to mask the faint, yet persistent, undertones of the nearby latrine, or the accumulated smells of unwashed bodies. It was an exercise in olfactory futility, a constant effort to paper over a fundamental systemic problem. The dark truth, then, is the futility of fragrance in the face of fundamental unsanitation. All the exquisite perfumes, all the precious resins, all the exotic spices, they were fighting a losing battle against the sheer, overwhelming reality of Roman filth. They could mask, they could layer, they could temporarily distract, but they could never truly eliminate the underlying odors. It was like trying to hide a garbage dump with a single air freshener, or drowning out a brass band with a kazoo. The perfumes were a testament to Roman luxury and refinement, certainly, but also to their profound inability to truly cleanse their environment or their bodies in a way that would satisfy modern sensibilities. So, while a Roman might smell of roses and civet musk, a deep breath would almost certainly still reveal the persistent, earthy, and profoundly human stench beneath. The dark side of Roman perfumes was the unspoken acknowledgement that, for all their grandeur, Rome was fundamentally, irrevocably, and perpetually malodorous. We started with the glorious Roman baths, a symbol of empire, and it's fitting to revisit them now to trace their fascinating evolution and eventual decline. From their humble beginnings to their peak as monumental social centers, and then their slow, inexorable fade, the story of the baths mirrors the rise and fall of Rome itself. Public bathing wasn't a sudden Roman invention. It evolved from simpler practices, bathing in rivers, natural hot springs, or rudimentary public washhouses. In early Republican Rome, bathing was a more private, functional affair, often done at home or in basic facilities. But as Rome grew in wealth and power, and as its engineering prowess developed, the concept of public bathing transformed. Small, privately owned bathhouses, balnea, emerged, offering heated rooms and plunge pools. These were the humble beginnings, the embryonic form of the grand institutions that would define Roman urban life. The peak popularity, the golden age of Roman baths, arrived during the imperial period. Emperors, vying for public favor and eager to display their wealth and power, sponsored the construction of colossal bath complexes like the baths of Caracalla, Diocletian, and Trajan. These weren't just functional spaces, they were architectural masterpieces, veritable cities within a city, adorned with marble, mosaics, and statuary. They were designed not just for washing, but for entertainment, education, and social interaction. Every major city, and even smaller towns across the empire, would boast its own baths, making public bathing a widespread and deeply ingrained part of Roman daily life, accessible to almost everyone for a nominal fee. Their construction was a testament to Roman engineering and their understanding of how to manage water on a grand scale. However, nothing lasts forever, not even the most glorious of bathhouses. The decline of the Roman baths in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages was a complex process, driven by a confluence of factors. Economic hardship played a significant role. Maintaining and heating these colossal structures and supplying them with vast quantities of water was incredibly expensive. As the empire faced fiscal crises, funding for public works declined, leading to neglected infrastructure, clogged aqueducts, and crumbling bathhouses. Barbarian invasions also contributed. The Vandals' cutting of Rome's aqueducts in 537 AD was a symbolic and very real blow to the city's water supply, and, by extension, its baths. Changing social norms and the rise of Christian asceticism also played a part. Early Christian teachings often emphasized spiritual purity over bodily indulgence, viewing excessive bathing and the often uninhibited atmosphere of the baths with suspicion. Modesty and the rejection of worldly pleasures led to a decline in their population, at least among certain segments of the population. By the time of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, many of the grand baths had fallen into disrepair, their structures plundered for building materials, their once bustling halls silent and overgrown. Yet, the memory of Roman baths persisted. Even as their physical structures crumbled into majestic ruins, the idea of large-scale public bathing, of civic amenities for health and relaxation, lived on in collective memory. Later civilizations, when they rediscovered these monumental ruins, marveled at their scale and ingenuity. The Roman bath, in its rise and fall, leaves a lingering legacy, a testament to both human ambition and the transient nature of even the grandest institutions. A reminder that even the most impressive engineering can succumb to neglect, changing tides, and the slow, grinding reality of decay. Just as the grand baths eventually crumbled, so too did Rome's network of sophisticated public toilets. For centuries, these communal latrines, with their rows of marble seats and flowing water, were a symbol of Roman urbanity, however unsanitary they truly were. But as the empire fractured, as urban centers declined, and as the economic and administrative infrastructure withered, the maintenance of complex sewer systems and public latrines became an insurmountable burden. The abandonment was gradual but inexorable. As cities shrank, as populations plummeted, and as the resources to fund and maintain public works dwindled, the public latrines became derelict. Aqueducts, which supplied the constant flow of water necessary to flush these facilities, were cut, either by invading forces or through simple neglect. Without a steady water supply, the latrines became stagnant, unusable, and ultimately abandoned. The once bustling halls where senators gossiped and plebeians conducted their business became silent ruins, choked with rubble and weeds. It was a poignant symbol of a civilization's regression in urban hygiene. With the collapse of these public amenities came the return to more primitive practices. For the majority of the population, the relative convenience of the public latrine was replaced by the stark reality of the chamber pot and outdoor defecation. Chamber pots, which had always been used in the upper floors of insulae, became the universal solution. Their contents, once again, were often simply emptied into the streets, mirroring the practices of centuries past, but now on a grander, more widespread scale across entire former urban centers. The streets, once somewhat mitigated by sewer grates and occasional cleaning efforts, became open receptacles for human waste once more. This meant that the Dark Ages, so often maligned for their supposed lack of hygiene, weren't necessarily more dirty than Rome at its peak. Rather, they represented a reversion to simpler, more decentralized, and often equally unsanitary methods of waste disposal. The centralized, monumental systems of Rome, for all their flaws, at least attempted to channel and remove waste. The medieval period, particularly in the early centuries, often saw a fragmented approach, with individual households responsible for their own, often less than ideal disposal methods. The grand, unified systems of Rome had collapsed, leaving behind a vacuum that was filled by a return to more basic and often just as unhygienic practices. The derelict latrines and clogged sewers became a literal and symbolic representation of urban decay. These decaying structures served as a physical reminder of a lost era of sophisticated public infrastructure. The once mighty Cloaca Maxima, still flowing beneath the city, continued to carry water, but its network of feeder pipes and associated latrines had largely ceased to function, leaving many without access to its benefits. The end of Roman public toilets was not just an administrative failure. It was a profound shift in daily life, a return to a more chaotic, less managed, and often profoundly unpleasant existence for the general populace. The streets of formerly great Roman cities once again became open sewers, silent testaments to an empire's decline and a civilization's regression in urban hygiene. So, after this rather exquisite descent into ancient grime, a question invariably arises. Why do we cling so fiercely to the myth of clean Romans? Why does Hollywood still insist on pristine togas and glistening marble, even when historical evidence screams otherwise? Perhaps it's a deep-seated human desire to romanticize the past, to imagine a golden age where even the mundane aspects of life were elegant and ordered. Or perhaps it's simply easier to digest a sanitized version of history rather than confront the uncomfortable, smelly, and often diseased reality. The ghost of Roman hygiene, that persistent illusion of purity, continues to haunt our popular culture. But the real legacy of Rome when it comes to hygiene isn't cleanliness. It's engineering, it's law, and it's a testament to human resilience and an astonishing tolerance for filth. The Romans gave us the concept of vast public water systems, of elaborate sewers, of public baths as social centers. They laid the groundwork, even if their understanding of the microscopic world was non-existent. The lessons learned, however slowly, were eventually profound. It took centuries of plagues, epidemics, and countless deaths for humanity to truly grasp the connection between sanitation, water quality, and disease. It was a brutal, extended learning curve, but one that eventually led to our modern understanding of germ theory, public health, and, yes, the invention of flush toilets and widespread access to clean, potable water. We owe the Romans a darkly humorous thank you, then, for paving the way for our modern sewers and germ theory. But not before providing us with millennia of interesting diseases, a compelling case study in the dangers of lead pipes, and a profound appreciation for antibacterial soap. Their innovations, while often inadvertently contributing to health problems, also laid the foundations for solving them. It was a long, winding road, paved with good intentions and questionable practices, but it eventually led us to a place where we can confidently and cleanly wash our hands after using the toilet. Reflecting on Rome's real legacy, it's not the pristine white togas, but the enduring structures that stand as monuments to their ambition and often flawed genius. The aqueducts, still supplying water in some places, are a testament to their engineering. The ruins of their baths are a reminder of their social prowess. But the pervasive stench, the ever-present disease, the casual daily interaction with filth, these are the lessons that truly bring ancient Rome to life, making it profoundly relatable in its struggles and surprisingly distant in its everyday realities. So, the next time you marvel at a Roman ruin, take a deep breath and remember the ghost of Roman hygiene, subtly whispering tales of lead poisoning and communal sponges. You'll never look at a Roman statue the same way again. I guarantee it. And that, my friends, is a victory. There's a curious human tendency, isn't there? This innate desire to romanticize the past, to look back through a hazy, sepia-toned lens and imagine the good old days. We yearn for a simpler time, perhaps one of grand empires and stoic philosophers, where life was noble and uncomplicated. We project our desires onto history, envisioning idyllic scenes that never quite existed. And nowhere is this tendency more evident than in our perception of ancient Rome, particularly its hygiene. The truth, as we've painstakingly scraped away, is that the good old days were in many ways, quite literally, the very, very dirty old days. The daily struggle was real. Roman life, especially regarding hygiene, was not an effortless display of civic purity. It was a constant, grueling, and often losing battle against dirt, disease, and an omnipresent stench. Every aspect of daily existence, from fetching water to using the toilet, from eating a meal to simply walking down the street, was fraught with challenges to cleanliness and health. Imagine the sheer mental and physical toll of living in an environment where basic sanitation was so profoundly lacking, where illness was a constant shadow, and where every breath you took was scented with a symphony of urban decay. It was a world that required an incredible resilience, a remarkable adaptation to conditions that would send most modern individuals spiraling into a germophobic panic. Our mission with this journey has been to challenge your perception, to pry open those romanticized notions and replace them with a more gritty, honest, and often darkly humorous understanding of ancient life. It's a challenge to the idea that ancient equals pristine, or that advanced engineering automatically equates to advanced personal hygiene. The Romans were ingenious, yes, but their brilliance was often blind to the microscopic realities that governed their health. This isn't about shaming them, but about truly understanding them in all their magnificent, malodorous complexity. And so, we arrive at a moment of profound, darkly humorous gratitude for our modern conveniences. Take a moment, won't you? Think about that flush toilet, that sparkling clean water flowing from your tap, that glorious antibacterial soap, the sheer unadulterated luxury of a private shower, the convenience of a modern sewage system that efficiently whisks away your waste without you ever having to see, smell, or even think about it. These are not trivial inventions. They are the bedrock of modern public health, the silent heroes that have fundamentally transformed our lives from the constant, low-grade biological warfare of ancient Rome into a relatively clean, relatively healthy existence. So next time you complain about your municipal water bill, spare a thought for the Romans and offer a silent, sardonic prayer of thanks for germ theory and indoor plumbing. Because, believe me, the good old days were anything but. They stank, quite literally, and you're very, very lucky you weren't there. As our journey through the glorious grime of ancient Rome draws to a close, let's allow a few final, unsettling thoughts to settle in, like the lingering dust of a Roman road. We've meticulously cataloged the smells, the unsanitary practices, the ingenious yet flawed engineering. But beneath all the historical facts and darkly comedic observations lies a profound and often overlooked truth: the unseen costs of empire. The human toll was immense, a silent, pervasive suffering that underpins the grandeur of Rome. Imagine the constant, low-grade fever, the persistent stomach ailments, the debilitating parasitic infections, chronic lead poisoning, subtly eroding cognitive function and physical health, the constant itch of skin conditions, the pain of untreated dental problems, the pervasive weakness from recurrent bouts of dysentery. This wasn't just an occasional inconvenience. It was the daily, grinding reality for countless Romans, a silent suffering from disease, infection, and chronic illness caused directly by poor hygiene and a fundamental lack of medical understanding. For every triumphant general, for every magnificent monument, there were thousands, if not millions, of ordinary Romans living lives shortened and diminished by preventable conditions. Life expectancy, for all but the most privileged, was brutally short. High infant mortality meant many didn't even make it to adulthood. Those who did faced a gauntlet of endemic diseases. While there were exceptions, the brutal reality was that lifespans were often cut short, not by battle or famine, but by common infections that we now easily treat. A simple cut could become fatal. A seasonal flu could decimate a household. The average Roman's life was a precarious walk through a microbial minefield where every illness was a potential death sentence. And so, we come to a concluding, slightly uncomfortable thought: the smell of power. The great Roman Empire, with all its might, its laws, its legions, its philosophy, was built on foundations of grime and squalor. The very air its emperors breathed, the very streets its senators walked, were permeated by the stench of its daily existence. The grandeur, the order, the discipline, it all coexisted with a profoundly unsanitary reality. Power, it seems, can be immensely impressive, but it cannot, by itself, conquer bacteria. It reminds us that even the most advanced civilizations are still ultimately human, still grappling with fundamental biological realities, and often still profoundly, fundamentally dirty. So, as you step back into your modern, relatively sanitized world, allow this lingering discomfort to remain. Let it color your perception of those impressive Roman ruins, those stoic marble busts. Remember the human cost, the daily struggle, the pervasive odors. Let it remind you of the fragility of life, the profound impact of unseen microbes, and the sheer, unadulterated luxury of your own sparkling clean bathroom. Because if this journey has accomplished anything, it should be to ensure you'll never look at a Roman statue, a toga, or even a communal sponge the same way again. And that, my friends, is a victory worth celebrating, perhaps with a very, very long, hot, soapy shower. All right, you magnificent, enduring history buffs. If you've managed to stay awake through this entire, rather exhaustive, and occasionally nauseating exploration of Roman hygiene, then congratulations. You've officially earned your honorary, invisible, and hopefully metaphorical strigil. Let's do a quick recap, shall we? Just in case the pervasive aroma of historical grime caused you to momentarily drift off. The baths? Glorious architectural marvels, yes, but also a communal human stew of sweat, oil, and whatever delightful skin conditions your fellow citizens were cultivating. The strigil? Forget gentle exfoliation. Think aggressive scraping, possibly with shared tools, and a delightful bucket of human gunk. The toilets? Communal, open plan, and often featuring a shared sponge on a stick. Yes, the sponge. You remember the sponge. And let's not even get started on the lead pipes, slowly poisoning everyone, because nothing says public health like chronic brain damage. Everything stank. Absolutely everything. Your clothes, the streets, the food, probably even your breath. Especially if you are gargling with stale Portuguese urine. Remember that? Good. The enduring message here is that Roman hygiene was a complicated, often horrific, but always fascinating topic. It wasn't simple. It wasn't clean by our standards. But it was a monumental effort for its time, a testament to their engineering prowess, even in the face of profound scientific ignorance. They did what they could, with what they knew, and the results were, well, memorable. So now, as the lingering echoes of ancient Roman stench hopefully frayed from your imaginary nostrils, it's time to send you off to your well-deserved, hopefully sanitary slumber. Dream of modern plumbing. Dream of antibacterial soap. Dream of flush toilets with individual partitions. And know that you are living in a true golden age of cleanliness. If you've managed to stay awake through this entire gloriously grimy 200-minute historical deep dive, consider subscribing. Or don't. History doesn't care. It simply is. But if you did enjoy this particularly dark and sarcastic descent into the past, leave a comment below with your favorite or most horrifying Roman grime fact. Hit that like button if you appreciate the profound luxury of a private, clean bathroom. And if you're feeling particularly generous, share this with a friend who needs to have their romanticized illusions of Rome thoroughly shattered. Until next time, stay clean, stay curious, and for the love of all that is holy, please wash your hands. Good night, you filthy animals.